King's Blood. Fence Sitters Anonymous. Summary. Maester Aemon still has his sight when Jon Snow arrives at Castle Black to swear his vows. Targaryens might have typically had pale hair and purple eyes, but Maester Aemon would recognize his family anywhere. His vows have been tested 3 times before. This is his 4th and final test, and, after nearly 80 years of being a bystander at the wall whilst his family destroyed themselves, Aemon decides that enough is enough. He's been a man of the Night's Watch for most of his life, but he's been a Targaryen all his life. He might be old and trapped at the wall, but he grew up in King's Landing and no one knows the Game of Thrones like he does. And so, everything changes. Chapter 1, Remember. Chapter Text. Chapter Summary. Maester Aemon reflects on his last 70 years at the wall and sees Jon Snow for the first time. Notes. This follows more the film series than the books, much like my other work. But will feature characters not included in the film series. As with my other work, I'll probably hit around 10k words per chapter. Each chapter likely featuring multiple POVs. Updates less frequently, probably, than my other work. 298 AC Aemon Targaryen. It took a great effort these days to drag himself out of his chambers and to anywhere at Castle Black other than the common hall to take his meals. He was old, his bones creaked even in the summer, his body was not as sprightly as it once was and it took him an age to walk anywhere, and his eyes were beginning to fail. In all honesty, took a great effort to do anything other than to sit and read. As he crossed the courtyard and headed towards the common hall, he reflected that it felt like he had aged suddenly these last 20 years. It was as though one day he had woken up and no longer had the body of a young man, even though at 80 he had been far more agile than men half his age. But these last few years he had felt the passage of time more keenly, he was no longer a young man. He paused halfway across the courtyard and gazed at the wall. It truly was beautiful and awe-inspiring. He was a learned man and, before his father had sent him to the citadel shortly after his 11th name day, he had travelled much, the benefit of being a third son. But he had never seen anything quite like the wall. He had never said as much to any of the men who had served with him at the wall for they would have thought him insane, but he was sure he could feel something from the wall. It was almost as though it was alive. It thrummed with power. When he had first arrived, he had toyed with whether it was magic, for magic did exist, there was no doubts about it. He had spent hours puzzling over the wall, the feeling it gave off, what he felt when he gazed at it until, one day, he had stopped puzzling. For what was he to do with any information he had found? No glory would be found in his examinations, and no one would care. He was simply examining it for his own interests and there were more important things to be done here. So, he had stopped. His eyes caught on the lift coming down from the top of the wall. It had been years since he had been to the top, over 40. He had not stepped foot on the wall since the day he had watched Brynden Rivers ride off for a range beyond the wall. He had refused to. Rivers might have brought much pain on his family in how he did the things he did, but he was still family. Even as a maester the bonds of family ran deep. Not deep enough it would seem, but deep. But Aemon would go up there and gaze out onto the horizon one last time before he died. He had promised himself he would, and he had yet to break a promise. Just like he had promised himself once, a long time ago, that if he had his chance again then he would do everything differently. A gust of wind whipped past him, and he shivered. Even in summer Castle Black was cold. The air and land around the wall were in a sort of permafrost where nothing ever grew or thrived. Beyond the wall and in the north the lands grew fertile and strong, but the closer to the wall one got the less life there was. He shivered again more forcefully and restarted his journey back to the common hall. The men had already started their meal by the time he had arrived. He eased himself into his chair and gave his bowl a sad look. Stew again. Just like it was yesterday and all the days before. Still, it was food, and it was good for his bones and body. He began to eat slowly and carefully. He liked to take his time, for even though the food would be cold long before he was done, eating was one of his small pleasures now. Age had left him with very little. He was nearly finished when PYP burst into the common hall, Stark and Lannister banners approach. He remained seated even as the other men poured out of the common hall. Benjen was returning, which was good news, but he did not wish to see Lannister banners. A man of the Night's Watch he may be, but he had been a Targaryen first, and what House Lannister's bannerman had done to House Targaryen was unforgivable. No. He would stay here. He smiled to himself as he pushed the stew around the bowl, desperately trying to avoid the last piece of venison, for it had to be in his last bite so he could savor the taste. He doubted whether any of his brothers really knew the real Aemon. For all that he was Maester Aemon, he had been born Aemon Targaryen, and blood was thicker than water and stronger than the vows the Night's Watch made him swear all those years ago. He would do his duty, he would stay at the wall, he would play nice if he met Tyrion Lannister, and he would die here. But he would not forget. Never. His vows had been tested 3 times, once as a boy, once as a man when he had been offered the crown, and once a decade ago when his family was destroyed. It was the most recent time when he had nearly broken them. But he had not. For what was a man of his age to offer 2 children at the edge of the world? He would have been more a hindrance than a help, even a decade ago. If he could do it all again, he would. But you didn't get to redo life just because you regretted how you had lived it. The gods were not kind like that. He spooned the last mouthful of stew into his mouth and savored the taste of the venison as it slid down his throat. He had always loved venison, and there was no shortage of it near the wall. Maester Aemon, you were not there for my arrival. Are you not pleased by my return? Benjen Stark said as he strode into the hall. I am always pleased to see you, my friend. I just find that I cannot eat as quickly as I am used to, he replied mildly. Benjen stopped short of the high table where Aemon sat and quirked an eyebrow at him. He was not fooled. Was it not you who told me that everyone deserved a chance? Aemon stared at him for a moment, then inclined his head. Benjen was right. He will be dining with us tonight in this hall tonight. You may be surprised by what you find in him, Benjen said as he smiled. Aemon nodded, for there was nothing more to say. Benjen left abruptly. Aemon stared after him. Something was wrong. But then he sighed. Benjen was an odd sort, but would tell him eventually. He always did. Aemon made his way slowly back to his chambers. He huddled down in the warmth, under his blankets, and pulled out one of his books. Age had taken much from him, but he was just glad that his eyesight remained. He did not think he could have coped it that was also gone. Reading gave him solace and peace. Reading the words that he had read 1,000 times allowed mind to focus on something whilst simultaneously let his mind wander. The words of Dragonkin flowed over him, and he lost himself in the descriptions of the great Targaryen dragons of old. How he longed to have lived in those times, in better times. When House Targaryen was strong and wise. When dragons had ruled the skies and all children of House Targaryen had dragons in their cribs and fire in their blood. Before they had doomed themselves. If he could do it again, he would have done everything differently. He would have stayed in King's Landing to support his brother, his young and naive brother. He smiled to himself, his brother who, despite all the odds stacked against him, married for loved and named his firstborn son for his best friend. He had been a good man. A good man engulfed by the evils of the world. His desire to do good and belief that they needed dragons to do it had been his doom. Dragons had not been what made House Targaryen powerful. Oh, they had helped. But it had been family that had been House Targaryen's real strength. Aemon sighed again. His brother had been naive and alone, and Aemon had done him a disservice by going to the wall despite thinking it was the right decision at the time. He should have stayed, family was all that mattered. But he was older now, wiser. He had made that decision as a youth and not knowing what the decision to go to the wall truly meant. Yet, here he was, years later. Alone at the edge of the world, resorting to rereading the words on the scrolls that arrived from King's Landing to hear any news about the last remaining kin. His last remaining family were alone, without guidance and without support. And he was here. Festering away and unable to help. Too frail to help even if he was willing to forsake his vows. By gods, he was cold. He put down the book. Self-pity would get him nowhere. He eased himself back out from under the covers again, shivering slightly in the cold of his chambers. The fire that he always kept burning was starting to fade. He hastily hobbled over and threw on some fresh wood and poked the fire to get the flames burning more vigorously. Once they were fanning out and upwards and the room was heating up again, he turned to head back into his bed to continue reading. Then he paused. There was a faint tugging. He could feel it. He was being drawn back to the fireplace. He sighed and turned around. He knelt carefully on the stone floor in front of the fireplace. The tugging increased. He reached carefully around the fireplace, mindful of the roaring flames, and pushed against the wall trying to find the right spot. Eventually he heard a groan of stone moving. He removed his hand carefully from the inside of the fireplace and moved around to the right-hand side. The false wall had popped out slightly. He smiled and tugged it forcefully to try and open it more fully. Finally, it opened further with another low groan. He moved closer to that he might peer inside. He smiled. It was just as beautiful as it was all those years ago when he had placed it inside the hollow wall of the fireplace. Men of the Night's Watch weren't allowed luxuries, and a dragon's egg was definitely one. It had been his. Put in his cradle when he was a baby. Of course, it had not hatched. By the time he had received his egg, dragons had been extinct for years. But it was still his. He might have given up his name and his family, but dragons had been a part of House Targaryen for 1,000 years. He would not willingly part with his. And so, it had come to the wall with him. He reached in to pull it out of the hollow. White and grey. Just as beautiful as it had been 50 years ago when he had last looked at it. He knew he was smiling more widely than before. It was instinctive. He was a Targaryen, and even an unhatched dragon egg did something to him. There was a stirring within him, one that had always been there when he held his egg. He felt more alive. More powerful. Invincible even. He peered at it carefully, turning it over in his hands. It was warm, warmer than he could ever remember it being, but it had sat inside a fireplace for 50 years, so that was to be expected. There was something else. But he couldn't put his finger on it. Something had changed. He ran his hands carefully over its smooth shell. It really was beautiful. A knock at the door startled him out of his inspection. He hastily put the egg back into the hollow and used the full force of his body weight to force the wall back into place. Then he scrambled up and turned to face the door. As he did so, he caught sight of the fireplace. The fire was out. He paused and quickly cast his window to the night sky. Darkness. He did not know how long he sat there cradling the egg carefully in his hands, but it must have been hours. The knock came again, more persistent this time. 2 quick raps followed by 3 longer. "I am coming, Benjen." He carefully rekindled the fire. It would be cold tonight, he could feel it, and he did not want to be coming back to an dead fireplace after his meal. Then he hobbled over to the door and opened it wide. "I thought something might have happened." "You are not usually so slow to respond," Benjen said loudly. Eamon tutted under his breath, "Your impatience is the impudence of youth. One day, not long from now, you will be the age I am today, and you will look back on this and hang your head in shame for hurrying an old man." Benjen blinked at him, then smiled widely. And when I do, you will be stood next to me ready to tell me another wise fact." Eamon smiled. "It is slightly icy tonight, Maester Eamon. Would you like me to escort you?" "I will be fine, Benjen," he said quietly as they began their stroll to the common hall. They walked slowly and in silence. Eamon kept half an eye on Benjen as they made their way across the courtyard. Despite the near 70-year age gap between them, and the fact that Benjen had lost his father and eldest brother to Eamon's great-nephew's insanity, they had developed a good and cordial friendship over the years. The first ranger often brought Eamon news from around Westeros after he had visited his brother, Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, and in turn Eamon would offer him guidance and advice on dealing with tricky recruits and navigating the lands beyond the wall. Despite never having traveled beyond the wall himself, having served at the wall as long as he had meant that Eamon had unparalleled knowledge of the workings of the wildlings and the Night's Watch. "My most valuable confidant and friend" was a phrase that Benjen once used to describe him, not knowing that Eamon could hear him talking to the Lord Commander. Eamon had never had children, being both a maester and man of the Night's Watch since he was practically child meant those things had been forbidden. But he often thought that if he had married and had a child, he would hope that that child would have grown into the sort of man Benjen Stark was, smart, observant and kind. He was a good man and one that Eamon was proud to call his friend. His friendship with Benjen was how he was able to see that something was horribly wrong. The man gave nothing away in his mannerisms or his voice, but his face said everything. There was a slight pinching between his eyes, his brows furrowed in an apprehensive look. There were deep, dark shadows under his eyes that spoke of many restless nights. His thin face, which emphasized his sharp features, looked thinner and paler than ever. He looked slightly sick. But Eamon could tell, just by looking at him, that Benjen was not sick. He was worried. "What is wrong, my friend?" he said eventually when they had crossed the courtyard and begun making their way up the steps towards where the common hall was. Benjen's stride faltered, and it was only through his quick reflexes that he managed to stop himself falling up the stairs. Eamon blinked at him expectantly. "There is nothing wrong," his friend said eventually, steadfastly keeping his eyes on the steps as they slowly made their way up them. Eamon tutted again under his breath and stopped at the top of the stairs. "You forget, Benjen Stark, that I grew up in King's Landing. I may have been shipped off to the Citadel before I was 2 and 10. And I may have been 6 and 10 when I swore my vows to this place. But I spent enough time in King's Landing to know a liar when I see one. During my childhood I met some of the best liars in Westeros. And I have met many good liars since. I cannot count you amongst them. You have always been a terrible liar. It is your honor that makes it hard for you, I think," he said gently. His friend did not say anything, and so Eamon waited patiently at the top of the steps, even as the biting wind whipped by. He repressed a shiver. He had always struggled with the cold more than other men of the Wall. Brynden Rivers had said it was his Targaryen blood, that it made him run hot, and so the cold affected him more. Benjen heaved out a deep breath and eventually turned to face him fully. "You truly consider me a friend?" "Of course," he replied in a faintly bemused voice. He had not taken Benjen for a man who needed reassurance before. "Promise me. Promise me that you shall always be my friend. That whatever ills you think I have done, you will always give me an opportunity to explain." He felt himself nodding before Benjen had even stopped talking. "Of course. Thank you." They began walking again in silence. He took another quick glance at his friend. Benjen's face was even whiter than it had been before. It was so drained of color that Eamon could see the veins underneath his skin. They were still walking in silence when they arrived at the doors to the common hall, and Benjen pushed them open. He smiled at his friend and stepped inside, relishing the heat that swept over him. He headed as quickly as he could towards the top table where he usually sat. He was halfway up there when he realized that Benjen wasn't with him. He did not turn though. It was not unusual for his friend to sit with the other men rather than on the top table. He took his seat, smiled at Lord Commander Mormont next to him, and looked at his stew. "Venison again. Just as it would be venison tomorrow." He smiled blandly at his bowl. He reached for his bread roll without looking up. The stew was as always, warm, and hearty. The carrots soft and the meat tender. At least that was what he tried to tell himself. For there was no benefit to be found in complaining. He had learned that a long time ago. "What do you think of the new recruits, Maester Eamon?" Lord Commander Mormont said eventually after minutes of silence ticked by between the two. He finished slurping his stew and turned his attention towards where Lord Commander Mormont's eyes were facing. There were 4 men sitting by Benjen Stark, which explained why his friend had not sat at the top table. He always liked to sit with the new recruits and to stick close by them their first few days. 2 of the 3 men were tall, clearly grown men who had seen summers and winters both. The third was a dwarf, the Lannister man. The last was sitting opposite Benjen with his back to him. He looked younger, at least from the back. Perhaps only just reaching manhood, with long dark hair. 2 for the Rangers, 1 for the stewards, he said after a brief pause. Then the black-haired boy turned his head, and Maester Eamon froze as he caught sight of the boy's full face, for the boy had turned around and was staring up at the top table. It was like seeing a ghost. "Oh, Benjen Stark. What have you done?" The boy was all Stark, to anyone who was only looking for House Stark in the boy's features. He had the dark eyes, the dark hair, the long face. The slightly sullen-looking appearance. But to Maester Eamon, who during his childhood had been trained to look for the things that weren't obvious, the boy's true parentage was as obvious as the nose on his face. The color of the eyes might have been all Stark, but the shape was almond. He was slender, not like the tall and thin form of Benjen, but slender in a way that made him seem unassuming. The straightness of his nose spoke of nobility in a way that House Stark had not had in centuries, at least no one in House Stark that Aemon had ever met. Aemon sighed and broke eye contact to spoon stew into his mouth. "Perhaps 3 for the Rangers," he said after a brief pause. Lord Commander Mormont nodded and said, "Ned Stark's bastard son, Jon Snow. He may make a good steward. But you are right, there is perhaps some Ranger in him." Then the Lord Commander stood and left the hall, his meal finished. Aemon kept his eyes on his plate whilst he finished his food. The benefit, he had often found, of being raised in King's Landing was that he was a master at concealing his emotions. And right now, he was pulling on every single piece of training he had ever received or learned to keep his emotions in check. His years of experience was the only thing holding him together, stopping him from shouting from the top table for all to hear. "Promise me. Promise me that you shall always be my friend. That whatever ills you think I have done, you will always give me an opportunity to explain." He sighed again and then swallowed another mouthful of stew. He had not promised Benjen, he had said of course, for he had long ago learned not to make promises to anyone. But Benjen was his friend, and he would hear him out. He raised his head again and waited until he caught Benjen's eye. Then he tilted his head slightly. His friend gave a short nod, then continued his conversation with Tyrion Lannister as though nothing had happened. As men began to leave the common hall, a few came up to him to ask advice or to just make conversation. He found that whilst he usually did not mind this daily ritual of the men, tonight it grated on him. But he bore it. He could not and would not let anyone know there was anything wrong. "Maester Aemon, would you like me to escort you back to your room?" Chet said quietly as men trickled out of the hall. He nodded and together they left the hall. The journey was faster than the other trips he had made to or from the common hall that day. He walked faster, with a sense of purpose. Keen to get away from Chet's talking so that he might have a moment of peace. "I find that I am not feeling well, Chet. I think in the morning I will stay in bed lest I make myself sick. Can you and Clydas attend to any routine business? If it is urgent it will need to wait until after the midday meal, I am afraid," he said more quietly than usual once they reached the door to his rooms. "Of course, Maester Aemon," Chet said. Then he turned and disappeared back into the courtyard. He watched him go and then, once the man was out of sight, he opened his door and quick shut it behind him. There in the privacy of his room, he leaned with his back against the door and slowly sagged to the ground. 70 years and more since he had last seen someone with his father's eyes. The color might be different, but the spacing between them and the shape was all Targaryen. He heaved out a sigh from the floor of his chambers. Curse Benjen Stark. He stared at a chip in the stone floor. He wanted to scream, to shout, to yell to whatever gods there might be that this was too far. That his blood still lived in Westeros and yet was destined to be confined to the wall, like he had been, was cruel. Surely the gods could not hate House Targaryen that much. But perhaps they did not. His eyes lifted from the stone floor and stared at the fireplace. Of course. Knocks on his door interrupted his chain of thought, 2 quick raps followed by 3 longer. He pulled himself to his feet with effort and sighed. Then he straightened himself up to his full height and gave the fireplace one last glance before he turned and opened the door. His friend entered, eyes on the floor. He was hunched over. Not his choice. He felt a twinge of sympathy for Benjen Stark. He could tell that the man was as unhappy about what had happened as he was. That his friend was worried that this was something too big to forgive. "Would you like some tea?" he said by way of a greeting once Benjen had turned around and he had shut the door. Benjen's eyes darted upwards and met his. Aemon smiled gently at his friend, for Benjen would always be his friend. No matter what. The bonds of friendship were not so easily broken. A few minutes later he was settled on his bed, the covers pulled tightly around his lap, and his friend was settled in the chair by his desk. They sipped their mint tea in silence. "Mint?" Benjen finally said after several minutes had passed by. He nodded. "Commander Mormont had some more shipped from White Harbor after I explained the benefits." They settled back into silence. "He is a good boy," Benjen eventually began. "I did not think otherwise." Benjen sighed. I do not want him to be here. I was overruled. I do not have a choice, came the biting response. Eamon leaned forward slightly. His mother. Lyanna. Roriga. Rape, he said in response. I do not know. Ned will not speak of it. Eamon sighed, then said, Roriga and I exchanged letters. He did not seem the sort. They never do. He nodded. Does he know? No. He thinks he is Ned's bastard, just like the rest of the world does. He must know. He cannot. Think of the danger it would put him in. I cannot do that to him. He will never forgive me. Benjen burst out. Which is it? Is it because he will be in danger? Or because you do not wish to hurt him? Or because you worry he will not forgive you? Or is it all three? A brief pause, then all three. Then you are a selfish man, Benjen Stark. His friend's eyes flashed up from his mug of tea to Eamon's face. He went to open his mouth and then closed it. Then he sighed and hunched forward. How do I tell him? How do I tell him his entire life is a lie? You do not need to, he replied gently, and when Benjen's eyes widened, he smiled at his friend. I will tell him. I cannot let you do that. He needs to hear it from me, came the response, even as Benjen's eyes returned their gaze to the mug. Rubbish. Tell me, what exactly does he need to hear from you? Does he need to hear about how he was lied to all his life? About how all his father's family are dead? About how his brother and sister were murdered? Tell me, my friend. How will you tell him that? Silence. You will not tell him. I will. He will not believe you. He will. A dragon knows a dragon. Do you wish me to be there? No. It is best that it is just me and him, I think. Benjen nodded. What if he decides to stay? He will not. You cannot be sure. I can, and I am. I have stayed here for over 70 years, Benjen Stark. I have sat and watched as my father died. As my brother died. As his son died. As his son died. As his son died. As his son and daughter died. I was old when my brother died. I was older still when my nephew, Jaehaerys, died young. I was 85 name days when my great-nephew, Aerys died. I was 85 name days when my great-nephew Roriga was murdered. Do you think if I had been 45 name days or 50 name days I would have stayed up here, wasting away at the edge of the world? I can tell you now, I would not have. Blood will always trump oaths. Always. And Jon Snow is not an old man. He is a boy, who has grown up a bastard, an outsider, with more family in this world than he knows about. Family that would accept him and embrace him. That is not something any man or child turns away from. Better men than me would have turned their back on the Night's Watch years ago. The only reason I did not was because I was old. Old and useless. He is neither old, nor useless. Nor is he sworn to the Night's Watch. There was a brief pause that followed his words, before Benjen breathed out so quietly that Maester Aemon nearly missed it. Thank you. You need not thank me, Benjen Stark. We are family. You cannot tell Jon, I imagine, because you swore to your brother that you did not. That is, I think, the only thing that would have stopped you telling the poor boy long ago. I, however, made no such promises. And this is a burden I will carry with pride and honor. Later that night, he lay in his bed in the dark and quiet, staring up at the ceiling above him. The flames flickered in the fireplace, casting small slithers of light across the room, and played with his mind. But it was not the flames keeping his mind active, he could almost feel it in the air. Something was waking up. He would bear this burden for Benjen Stark. He had decided it the moment he had seen Jon Snow's face. Benjen had been so transparent in his desire for Jon not to join the Night's Watch that it almost seemed beyond belief that he had brought the boy north with him. Damn Stark honor. His mind turned to tomorrow when he would meet Jon Snow. He heaved out a deep breath and closed his eyes. He had not been Aemon Targaryen in nearly 80 years. He had sworn his vows and he had turned his back on House Targaryen, on his family. But no more. He could remember the good times, of the peace his family had tried to bring to the realm, of the stability, of the love he bore for his brother. of the good house Targaryen had done. He could remember the betrayals they had faced, the mistakes they had made. But Jon was not his father, nor his grandfather. And he deserved to know who he was. So now, he was not Maester Aemon, not anymore. He was Aemon Targaryen again, son of Kingmaker I Targaryen, and he would atone for the mistakes of the past. There was no justice to be found in being honorable. No survival to be found in being a bystander. There was only fire and blood. Aemon Targaryen would not stand on the sidelines of history again and watch disaster befall his house. Jon Snow would not be joining the Night's Watch and waste away at the end of the world when he had the blood of kings in his veins. Aemon would tell him who he was, and then Jon Snow would carve out his own destiny. Aemon had been a man of the Night's Watch for most of his life, but he'd been a Targaryen all his life. Chapter 2, Memories. Chapter Text. Chapter Summary, Aemon Targaryen meets Jon Snow and Ghost. Jon sees the world for what it is. 298 AC Aemon Targaryen. The sun dawned bright and beautiful. It had been a long time since Aemon had truly admired the rising sun. When he was younger, he had used to sit with Egg on their shared balcony in the Red Keep and gaze over the black water rush and watch the sun rise. Together they used to imagine that if they had been the dragon riders of old, they would have been out riding their dragons as dawn broke across the narrow sea, and they would have tried to outpace the rising sun on their flight back to King's Landing. It would have been glorious. Then he had spent years avoiding the sunrise. The once beautiful memories of his brother and their time together, cut short by his own choosing, marred the experience, and made the memories bittersweet and painful. Now, at his age, Aemon could admire it for what it truly was. Another day. Another opportunity. A chance to redo the mistakes he had made in the days and years before. He stood on the battlements overlooking the courtyard and tilted his head up to the sky. It was still unbearably cold on his old bones and his furs were wrapped close around him, but with the sun beating down on his face it was not as bad as it might have been. If anything, the cold breeze invigorated him. Besides, he had good reason to brave the cold today. He smiled as he tilted his head down slightly and looked at the courtyard. Jon Snow was sparring with Benjen. The boy moved quickly and deftly, fending off Benjen's attacks. He was good. At only just 5 and 10 he was, perhaps, the best swordsman the Wall had seen in a long time. He was not just fast and agile, he was clearly predicting the moves Benjen made by reading Benjen's face and body because he was moving a fraction of a second after Benjen had started moving. Faster than a man responding. It was incredible to witness. It was almost a shame that the boy was destined for greater things. He would have been an asset to the Wall. A low rumble made him turn his head down towards his feet. He had heard the rumors that the boy possessed a direwolf. The men had called it a beast, said that it didn't belong there. And it didn't. Direwolves were like dragons, untamable and wild, fearless and dangerous. Yet, Jon Snow and according to the rumors all his cousins had managed to tame them. They had taken them as pets. He smiled at the animal. It was beautiful. A startling white that mirrored the color of the ice wall behind it perfectly. Its eyes were Targaryen red, bright and powerful. He cast his eyes over its legs, its back and finally its haunches. The direwolf was powerful and even stood still. There was a strength in the way it held itself that spoke of danger. "You are magnificent," he said quietly to the animal. The animal huffed and sat down on its haunches. Aemon resisted the urge to pat the creature. Beautiful it might be, and it might currently appear friendly, but it was not his. It would not be appropriate to pat the animal without at least asking his master or the animal for permission. For whilst an animal of legend like a direwolf did not belong to anyone, it would be rude to simply assume he could treat how he wished. Aemon watched the animal closely out of the corner of his eye as he turned most of his gaze back to Jon. The direwolf was smart. It was watching Aemon with all the intelligence of a human. It was not gazing at him like a common hound might, but instead appeared to be weighing him up. Passing judgment, almost. He turned his full attention back to Jon Snow. It was the right decision. For a moment later he could feel a wet snout pressed itself into his side. Aemon removed his hand closest to the direwolf from inside his cloak and let it hang loosely by his side. A second later, the snout was pressed into his hand and pushing his hand up and over until it rested gently on top of the direwolf's head. He smiled, resisting the urge to turn around or glance down. "You truly are magnificent," he said more quietly. Then he withdrew his hand and tucked it back inside his cloak, away from the biting cold. The direwolf let out a loud huff and then trotted away. Eamon turned his fully attention back to the courtyard. More men than him were watching Benjen and Jon Snow spar. He smiled to himself. The boy was truly captivating, just like Egg had been. There was something that seemed to draw men to Jon Snow. Even as he watched, Alisa Thorne walked out of the door leading to the men's quarters and paused just after the doorway to watch. Thorne's eyes crinkled slightly and then he scowled and turned away. Eamon smiled. Even Thorne thought Jon Snow was good. Eamon turned and continued his journey back to his room. It was too cold for him to stand outside for too long, no matter how much he wished to continue watching. He had often wished to have his quarters closer to the rest of the men. But being a maester meant that his quarters needed to be separate. He treated the sick and sometimes the illnesses the men caught would, if given half a chance, run rampant through Castle Black and kill every man there. He had wished it more when he was younger, newly arrived at the wall. He had been so lonely then. Brynden Rivers was not his ally nor his friend, but he was the only one who really reminded him of home. Then Brynden left and he truly was alone. The years had passed and slowly all the men who had sought him out, who had known he was a Targaryen and wanted to talk to him, to know what it was like to live the life he had died. More recruits joined, but he was simply Maester Aemon. It wasn't that he longed to be Aemon Targaryen back then. But the interest that men had shown in him made him feel less lonely. As he grew older, he began to like the isolation of his chambers. It gave him time to think and to reflect. Whilst too much time alone with one's thoughts was dangerous, sometimes it was just nice to think. Today was one of the ever-increasing days where he was glad beyond measure that his quarters were separate from the rest of the men's. As he made his way closer to his quarters he was stopped by Chet. "Maester Aemon. I had not thought to see you outside. You said last night you were not feeling well." "Oh yes." He smiled benignly at Chet. "I thought some early morning fresh air might do me good, but it appears I was wrong," he said. Then he hacked out a cough which had Chet looking worried. "Do not worry. I am sure a day's rest will do me good." That was the problem with getting old, he was growing forgetful. He sighed as Chet ran off and then continued to his chambers. The door opened after great effort on Eamon's part, and he hurried inside into the warmth. The fire was still going strong, just as it had been an hour before when he had left it after hearing the clang of training swords. He bustled over to the fireplace, knelt in front of it, arms outstretched, to warm himself up. The heat soothed his aching bones and brought a smile to his face. He wondered whether Jon Snow would find the same peace in the flames that he so often did. Once he was warmed through, he rose gingerly to his feet and headed towards his bed. He knelt again on the floor by the headboard and tugged heavily to pull out the small chest he had left there, untouched, for 50 years. Dust clouds flew over him as he tugged several times to drag it out. He hacked out a cough and smiled. The dust did not bother him, in fact it was a good thing. It meant that no one had disturbed the small chest, not that he really thought they would have. These were his chambers, and no one entered bar him unless invited. But one could never be too careful. Once the chest was free, he ran his hands over the top. The ornate carvings were hidden by a thick layer of dust. He blew on it and sent more dust flying into the air. Once he was satisfied and he could see the intricately carved dragons and flames on the chest, he leaned back on his knees and peered carefully at it. Should he open it now or wait for Jon Snow? He leaned further back on his knees. He would wait. With that matter decided, he heaved himself to his knees, pulling on the side of his bed as he did so to ease his ascent. He huffed out a deep breath once he stood on his legs. He was getting old. He settled down on his bed, legs dangling over the edge, hands clasped in his lap, and waited. He did not have to wait long. Less than an hour later there was a knock on his door. "Come in," he called out. The door squeaked open and Jon Snow's head poked through. He smiled softly at Aemon. "Maester Aemon, my uncle Benjen said you wished to speak to me." Aemon nodded. "Of course. Please do come in. Have a seat," he said as he gestured towards the chair by his desk, only a few feet away from his bed. Jon pushed the door open more fully, exposing his direwolf's form next to him. He paused and then said forcefully, "Ghost. Wait," and made to shut the door. Eamon smiled, "He can enter. Just keep him away from the fireplace, please." The smile Jon gave him was breathtaking. Just like Egg's was. "Thank you, Maester Eamon. Everyone else seems to be too terrified to let him near them," the boy replied even as he gestured for Ghost to enter the room. Eamon leaned forward slightly in anticipation of what Ghost would do. The direwolf paused on the threshold for a moment and a cold breeze swept through the room. He cocked his head and met Eamon's eyes, then he heaved out a heavy pant, trotted over and settled himself down between Eamon and the chest and closed his eyes. "It is no bother. We met earlier, he is magnificent," Eamon said as he drew his eyes away from Ghost. "Your brothers and sisters have them as well, I have heard." He was the runt," Jon said as he shut the door and crossed the room to the chair that Eamon gestured to. "As was I was always the smallest of my brothers. Yet here I am, nearly a century later," Eamon remarked. "He is not yet full grown." Jon shook his head, "No. His mother was nearly twice his size." Eamon smiled at the direwolf who, as though sensing Eamon's eyes on him, lifted his head and panted at him. "He likes you." Eamon broke eye contact with the direwolf and shifted slightly on the bed to look at Jon, who had leaned forwards in his chair with an air of interest. "He does not like many people. He tolerates them, but he does not like them. My father says that if a direwolf does not like a person, then one would be wise to be wary of that person. Natural instincts. He is a creature of legend and magic. None have been seen south of the wall for 200 years. There is a reason for that. They do not belong in the land of men," Eamon said softly even as Ghost rose and butted him on the leg with his nose. He leaned forward slightly, still keeping his eyes on Jon, and held out the hand. As he had done earlier, the direwolf shoved his head into Eamon's hand. Eamon smiled as he continued, "That he is so loyal to you. And his littermates are to your brothers and sisters is a testament both to his intelligence as an animal and the magic that flows in House Stark. I do not suppose such a creature could exist peacefully with anyone other than a Stark." He flicked his fingers slightly to scratch behind the direwolf's ear and Ghost huffed out a happy snort. "He is a gift from the gods. You are lucky." "Maester Eamon. But he seems to like you well enough." "He really likes you," Jon said as his eyes flicked between his direwolf, who was leaning in for more scratches, and the Maester. Eamon smiled and withdrew his hand. Ghost huffed another snort and settled back down. "You will be wondering why I asked to speak to you," Eamon said, not responding to Jon's unasked question. "Yes, Maester Eamon." "The fireplace. Put your hand into it. Right hand side. There will be a spot that feels slightly different, smoother, give it a firm push." The boy blinked at him and cast Ghost, who seemed to huff out an encouraging snort, a long look, then rose. He walked over to the fireplace and knelt in front of it and did as bid. He had a graceful walk, Eamon reflected as the boy knelt in front of the fireplace and stuck his hand through the flames, just as Egg had. In any other setting it would seem like a prowl, but in the quiet of Eamon's chambers it came across as less threatening. His mind was pulled back to the present as the telltale groan of the wall moving permeated the air. He leaned forward on his bed. "What do I do now?" the boy's voice came from the inside of the fireplace. Eamon smiled. "Remove your hand and head towards the outer right-hand side. The false wall will have popped out. You will need to use quite a bit of strength to pull it out more fully. There is something in there. Pull it out, but be very careful." The boy tugged on the wall, leaning back to get enough force behind his pulls. Then when the wall pulled out fully with a final loud grinding of stone, the boy leaned forwards. Eamon waited expectantly. He was not disappointed. "Maester Eamon," came the hushed voice of Jon Snow. The boy's head emerged from the hollow and gazed at him in shock. The unguarded expression on the boy's face made Eamon's smile widen. He looked so like Egg. "Bring it to me," he said quietly. The boy's head dipped back inside the hollow before, several moments later he emerged, slightly dusty, with the egg clasped in his hands. He rose gingerly, an expression of awe on his face, and walked slowly back over to the bed. He didn't sit on the chair this time but sat next to Eamon on the bed, closer than anyone had sat to Eamon in years. Their legs were inches from touching. Eamon closed his eyes. He longed to close the gap and pull the boy into a hug. Family. But they were not family. Not yet. Not as far as John knew. He had to wait. To be patient. He had waited close to 80 years for this. He could wait a bit longer. He opened his eyes. Jon Snow had not noticed Aemond's inner turmoil. He was sat on the bed, side by side with Aemon, his gaze fixed steadfastly on the egg. Aemon smiled to himself and waited for several moments. He would give the boy time. "What do you feel?" Aemon asked eventually. "Life," the boy whispered, as shock and awe spread across his face. He turned slightly on the bed so that he was gazing at Aemon. Their eyes met and the boy smiled widely. "I feel life." Aemon nodded. The boy returned his gaze to the egg. "What else do you feel?" Aemon said gently. The boy's eyes moved back to him, and he said, even more quietly than before, "Agitation. Impatience." Aemon smiled, but Jon did not see it, for he was already looking at the egg again with wide eyes. He felt Ghost brush his leg with his snout but did not react. "It is beautiful," Jon said after several more moments of silence. Then, with what seemed to be great effort, he pulled his eyes away from the egg and said quietly, "How can I feel life? How can I feel its emotions?" Aemon chewed his lip and moved his gaze from Jon to the egg. He stared at the egg thoughtfully. He had not quite considered that this would be a question that was asked, although he supposed that it was the obvious one. Eventually he settled on a long version of an answer and turned his attention back to Jon. "You wished to know why your direwolf accepted my attention and settled by my legs." As he watched, Jon blushed and turned his gaze back to the egg. "My name, before I was Maester Aemon, was Aemon Targaryen. Son of Kingmaker I Targaryen and elder brother to King Aegon V Targaryen. This was my egg. It was placed in my crib when I born, and it has spent the last 90 years as my egg. I can feel it, as you can. Your direwolf tolerates my presence better than most because he knows what you do not." There was a brief pause as Jon gazed at him, mouth slightly parted. "You're a Targaryen," the boy breathed out. Aemon nodded. "As are you. Only a Targaryen could feel life in that egg. Only a Targaryen could know what that egg thinks. That is why your direwolf tolerates my presence, because we are kin," Aemon said softly, so as not to spook Jon. The boy did not say anything for a moment. His eyes widened and then they closed. Fear and then resentment washed over his face. "My Aunt Lyanna?" he asked quietly, clearly not daring to ask the full question. "Yes." "How did you know?" "Your face. You have the same eyes as my brother, Egg. Their shape is quite distinctive of House Targaryen. The color might be different, but the shape is all Targaryen. Your nose tells me you're of noble birth. It is straight and arched and set between sharp cheekbones. My brother Aerion had the same nose. Your build is lean and slender, the same as me in my youth. At first glance, you are easily mistaken for a Stark. On the surface you look just like your uncle, Benjen. But to anyone who is really looking and knows what to look for, it is obvious. The only Targaryen woman alive when you were born was Queen R'hllor, and it was well documented that she gave birth to one child, a daughter, around the possible time of your birth. So, your father had to be a Targaryen and your mother a Stark. As I said, it was obvious to anyone who knew what to look for and knew the history," he said softly. Then he smiled. "A dragon knows a dragon, Jon Snow, and magic knows magic." Jon stayed silent for a while, his eyes fixed on the egg. A tear slipped down his cheek. "Ghost could sense who you were." "I believe so. It is the most obvious answer as to why he is so docile and trusting with me when he does not know me. He sought me out earlier in the courtyard. I do not imagine he does that with others. Some might argue it's because I am old and clearly no threat. But you saw how he leaned into my affection." "Pack knows Pack," Jon said quietly. His eyes moved from the egg to glance at Ghost, who was sitting patiently leaning next to Maester Aemon. Aemon watched as Ghost huffed out a snort and then rose. He was taller at his withers than the bed the two men sat on. He took 2 very slow paces forward. Then he huffed out another snort and settled his nose on Jon's lap, next to the egg. Aemon smiled softly. "It is yours." Jon tore his eyes away from the combination of Ghost and the egg to gaze at Aemon open-mouthed. "I cannot take your dragon egg. It belongs with you." Why not? The egg may hatch for you, it may not. But what use is it here, Jon Snow? Here it will stay in that hollow of my fireplace. It will not hatch for me, for if it was going to hatch for me it would have done so before I became old and useless. When I die no one will know it is there. It will sit there for eternity, abandoned and alone. I cannot think of anything worse for a sentient being. I am swearing my vows within the week. I will be a man of the Night's Watch. I have no use for a dragon egg. Being what I am does not change my future. Does it not? You have an aunt and uncle across the narrow sea who are alive. You have an egg, which if you wanted to sell, would allow you to live your life safely with them. They would welcome you with open arms. They would not shun you, Aemon replied in a gentle voice. He did not wish to spook the boy. He watched Jon carefully. The boy's hands were moving backwards and forwards over the egg without seeming to realize what he was doing. Aemon tried a different tact. A dragon is like a direwolf. It needs freedom. It needs to live. And you are a dragon and a direwolf. You were not made to be chained to this wall to spend the rest of your days polishing armor or fighting wildlings. I would not sell the egg, Jon replied absently as his fingers traced the swirls on the egg's shell. The egg is stark colors, he said eventually, after several moments of silence passed. I read a book once that said the color of a dragon egg signified what color the dragon would be. His eyes rose to meet Aemon's. They were bright, alive. Aemon smiled, yes. They say the color of the egg is a reflection on what the dragon will look like. Jon's eyes turned back to the egg. Stark colors, he said again more quietly. Stark colors on a Targaryen dragon, Aemon replied softly. There was another lengthy pause. Aemon regarded the boy carefully. His eyes were wet as he gazed at the dragon egg. He was hunched over, looking far younger than his 5 and 10 years. He looked like a lost little boy, broken and afraid. But there was a fire in him, Aemon could see it. Do you think it was destined for me? Jon said, his voice barely above a whisper. It feels like it was. Aemon started. Then he turned his gaze to the boy who was still staring at the egg. Mayhaps. It was, after all, entirely possible. Egg thought once that it might hatch for him. He could feel life, like we both can. But he could feel more than me, but less than you. It is entirely possible that the egg was always destined to be yours. Or your descendants. The boy sighed and turned his attention away from the egg and ghost. His eyes fixed on the fire and a tear slid down his cheek. All I ever wanted was to know who my mother was. To know that she had loved me. Uncle never told me. He just said he would tell me someday. And yet someday never came. It was always someday, never today, Jon said quietly as his hands continued to clench around the egg. I used to pretend she was a high-born woman, that she was beautiful, he said even more quietly. A tear slipped down his face as he turned his gaze back to Aemon. I used to pray that she missed me and loved me. That I had a true family out true somewhere. I love my brothers and sisters, for they are still my brothers and sisters, despite what I have learned today. But a family that loved me and wanted me to be part of their life. And now I have that chance. And I wish you had never told me. How could anyone accept me knowing what I am? Aemon sighed. He wanted to heap scorn on Ned Stark, to call him a selfish coward. But he could not. Instead, he leaned over and firmly gripped his hands back around Jon Snow's again. Do not think about how you came to be. Do not dwell on a past you cannot understand and will never know. Do not condemn yourself to a life of misery and regret because you think that is all you are worth. Focus instead on what you know to be true. You can feel life in that egg. You have a family out there who would welcome you. You have me. You have your Uncle Benjen. You have your brothers and sisters, Aemon said forcefully. When Jon did not look away from the fire, but another tear slid down his cheek, he tried a different tact. Ned Stark should have told you. But when was he to? When would have been a good time? When you were a child? When you were a man? He waited because by not telling anyone it kept you safe. You are alive because he did not tell anyone. Resent him all you want. Curse him. Hate him. But remember that he kept you safe. Jon turned his baleful eyes on him. You are right. But at what cost? He did not even tell Lady Stark. I grew up alone and isolated, the bastard of Winterfell. My brothers and sisters reminded me of it often enough. Lady Stark despised me and made my childhood miserable. I had to do worse in the sparring yard and in lessons than Robb because she did not like it when I succeeded. She never hurt me. But she made sure I knew I was not wanted. How different would my life have been if she had known? Even if he did not tell me, he could have told her. And when could he have? According to what I have heard, by the time she arrived in Winterfell after the war, you were already there with a nursemaid. She had spent less than a moon with her husband then. Could he trust her? Most men would not have. And years later, when she bore him children and loved him, could he tell her then? She likely would never have forgiven him. So instead, he chose cowardice. He chose the easy route, to lie to us both, Jon said scathingly. Greater men than you or I have made graver mistakes than Eddard Stark did 5 and 10 years ago, Aemon replied. Jon heaved out a sigh. I hate him, he whispered quietly, his voice cracking at the end. Aemon released his grip on the boy's hands. You will not hate him forever. One day, and it may not be for years, you will have children of your own and you will understand why he did what he did. You can hate him now if it makes you feel better, but whilst you do, you must remember that he did it because he loved you. He made mistakes, and make no mistake, I curse him for it, but he did it for the right reasons, he said softly. I will not have children. I am swearing myself to the watch. No. You are not, Aemon snapped back. Jon made to half rise from the bed, but suddenly Ghost was there, snapping at him. The boy sat back down and stared at his companion in shock. Even Ghost agrees, Aemon said smugly, feeling vindicated. Then he reached out to put his hand on Jon's shoulder, feeling slightly guilty for his momentary elation when the boy was in so much pain. Take it from a man who has been wedded to the watch for nearly his entire life, this is not the place for you. Even if you were not a Targaryen, it is not the place for you. You should not waste your life here. Jon stayed silent for a long time, and Aemon grew worried that the boy might snap at him and reject him. Eventually the boy's shoulders hunched in, and he said, Where would I go? I am alone. Essos, to find your aunt and uncle. Winterfell, to tell your family who you are. Or you could just travel and live. Jon nodded even as his eyes stayed fixed on Ghost. You will not tell me what to do. Aemon dropped the hand from Jon's shoulder. No, I will not, he said gently. Then he sighed and said, Your whole life people have told you what to do. How to think. How to act. What your future is. I will not tell you what to do. It is your life, Jon Snow. Only you can decide what you want to do with it. Then he sighed, When you are ready, and it does not have to be today or even tomorrow, the contents of this chest belong to you. Whatever you decide to do, it is yours. The only thing I will ever ask of you is this: before you make your decision, open the chest. What's in it? Jon said in a quiet voice as his eyes flicked once from Ghost to the chest and then to the egg, where they stayed. Relics. Memories. Letters. Asterisk asterisk. Several hours later, Jon left Aemon's chambers. Before he left, he shoved the chest back under the bed, promising to return to open the contents. The tear streaks on his face were long gone, and, if one had not been looking for the signs of agitation in the boy, no one would know anything more had been said than a conversation between a boy hoping to join the Night's Watch and the Night's Watch longest-serving member. But Aemon knew what to look for. He knew Jon Snow now. The boy's fingers were twitching slightly. He wished to pick up his sword and work off his anger and hurt. The direwolf, who had stayed silent and still for most of the morning in Aemon's chambers and who would have been expected to bounce around with the energy of a puppy after hours of confinement, was solemn and slow, walking side by side with his master in a show of support and strength. Aemon sighed as the door closed behind Jon Snow and turned his gaze to the egg in his hands. It felt warmer. Warmer than it should, given it had been out of the fireplace for hours now. He ran his hands over its scales and tilted the egg slightly, watching as light from the fire bounced off it, throwing patterns around the room. Is he to be yours? I think he is. I could not say as much to him, but there is a life in you that I have never felt before, he whispered quietly to the egg. He got no response, as was to be expected. He sighed again. I know I said I will not push him and show him what to do. Do you think it was the right decision? he asked the egg. Then he smiled to himself. If his family could see him now, they would all have thought him addled, and said quietly, I do not know if it was. He has spent his whole life being told what to know, knowing he was expected to join the watch. I am not sure if he has ever made a decision for himself before. Is this too big a decision for him to make alone? Or is it right that I treat him as a man and not as a boy? He paused and considered the egg again as he stopped turning it over in his hands. You're a good listener. But you do not give very good advice. 2 quick raps and 3 longer knocks at the door interrupted his thoughts. One moment, please, Benjamin. He called out as he hurried to the fireplace, put the egg back in its hollow and pushed it closed. He moved to stand in front of the fireplace and said, Enter. There was a slight squeaking as the door opened. Eamon turned as the door closed to survey his friend. Benjamin looked tired, the circles under his eyes were deeper and his bottom lip was missing small bits of skin where the man had clearly chewed through it in nerves. Eamon tutted under his breath and gestured for Benjamin to set the tray of food he was carrying on the desk. How did it go? Benjamin said quietly as he set the food down and made to move back towards the door. There appears to be enough for 2 here, Eamon remarked blandly as he sat on the bed and pulled the tray slightly closer to him. Sit. Benjamin paused and then tossed Eamon a wry smile. He sat on the chair by the desk. It went as well as could be expected. He has a good handle on his emotions. Benjamin nodded, he always has done. Sullen is what others have referred to it as. I have always viewed it more as guarded. Cautious. Eamon nodded even as he said, it makes sense, of course. When Benjamin cast him a slightly baffled look, he continued, when I studied at the Citadel there were papers on the human mind. How we think. Why we think it. How we react in situations. John has always had to grow up being mindful of what he does, says, acts. It is not surprising that he guards his emotions closely. Benjamin leaned forward and took a slice of bread off the plate and chewed on it thoughtfully. Do you think he'll be okay? I cannot be sure. But he will not be staying at the wall. Whatever he does, he will not stay here. How do you know? Eamon smiled sadly even as his eyes moved from his bowl of stew to the fireplace where the dragon egg was hidden. A dragon knows a dragon. 298 AC Jon Snow. Jon left Maester Eamon's chambers and made his way across the courtyard, Ghost at his heels. He didn't know where he was going. All he knew was that he needed air. He paused as his attention caught on the lift that had just stopped at the bottom of the wall. Stay here, Ghost, he said quietly. Then he crossed the courtyard quickly and headed for the lift. He did not speak to the other men on the lift as they made their way slowly to the top of the wall. He kept his eyes fixed on the distance, as more and more of the north became available to see. By the time he reached the top of the wall, and the others had disembarked, it felt like he could see the whole of the north. He paused for a moment, savoring the view. Get off or go down, snarled the man manning the lift. Jon jerked out of his thought and cast the man an apologetic smile before he stepped out. He shivered as a cold breeze whipped past him and pulled his cloak tighter around his shoulders. Ignoring the other men stood by braziers belching out flames, he strode off in the opposite direction towards a quieter spot on the wall. He heaved out a sigh once he was far enough away from the other men that he could no longer hear their conversation. He spun on the spot and faced the lands beyond the wall. It was beautiful. Trees spanned across the land as far as he could see, a vast expanse of green that sheltered from view the thousands of wildlings he knew dwelled within it. In the far distance he thought he could make out the tops of snow-tipped mountains, but, with the light of the sun casting shadows, it could easily have been a trick of his mind. It was deathly quiet. He could not hear birds nor beasts as he gazed into the distance. He sighed again. He knew he was being watched, even from a distance he could feel eyes on him, and he could not, and would not, show weakness. He straightened his spine and uncrossed his arms but kept his gaze fixed on the distance. I had planned to piss off it before I leave, ideally today. But you appear to have stolen my spot, Snow, came a voice from next to him. Jon jerked and turned his eyes downward. Tyrion Lannister stood next to him, wrapped up in so many furs that his face could hardly be seen, and gazing out at the lands beyond the wall. Sorry, my lord, he said quietly. What is wrong, Snow? You have always been the quiet and broody type, but you seem more so today. The wall not matching your expectations? No. It is not. Yet you find that you cannot bring yourself to leave, lest you disappoint your father and upset Lady Stark, the dwarf remarked blithely. Something like that, he responded after a lengthy silence. Tyrion Lannister tutted under his breath and turned to face him, gazing up at him with misshapen eyes that were uncharacteristically sympathetic. It was not a good look on the dwarf, for it made them seem even smaller than usual. Can I perhaps be of some assistance? You said all dwarfs are bastards in their father's eyes. Do you truly believe that? My father does. So, I suppose I do, came the nonchalant response. Tyrion pulled his eyes away from Jon then and stuck his hands into the cloak pocket to pull out small wineskin that, when he opened it, smelled strongly like ale. The dwarf took a deep swig and then said, "Yes, I suppose I do. Maybe if I had another father I would not. But I have the father I have. I cannot change that. None of us can." Jon shook his head when the dwarf offered him the wineskin and turned his eyes back to the lands beyond the wall. "Why do you stay with House Lannister? Why do you split your time between Casterly Rock and King's Landing if you know that he hates you?" he said after several moments' silence had elapsed. His eyes flicked back down to the dwarf, but he tried not to turn his head so as to avoid making it obvious he was looking at him. The dwarf gave a wry smile. "I suppose that I hope that one day I will stop being a dwarf, or that one day he will see me as his son." "Do you think he will?" "No. But I keep waiting and hoping. And drinking." "Drinking helps," the dwarf replied as he offered Jon the wineskin again. This time Jon took a hearty swig from it. The ale burned its way down his throat, and he coughed and spluttered. "The ale they have here is not up to much, my apologies, bastard." Jon cast him a baleful look and passed him back the wineskin. He returned his gaze to the lands beyond the wall again and sighed quietly. "What will you leave? A day or so? My cock is beginning to freeze, and I grow worried I might never use it again if I stay here much longer." Jon cracked a wry smile, even though it was not really funny. "If you do not think your father will ever grow to see you as his son, why bother? Hope in the face of defeat seems futile." Tyrion looked up with a wry smile of his own. "I suppose I have nowhere better to go. Better to be a rich dwarf than a poor dwarf. And better to be alive than dead. If I were poor, I doubt it would live long. Being a Lannister at least gives me the luxury of money. The luxury of a feather bed is not to be underestimated." The dwarf belched out a laugh. Then he said in a more gentle voice than Jon had yet heard him use, "Might I offer some advice?" Jon inclined his head but did not turn his gaze. "Do not swear your life to anything or to anyone if you are not sure. The wall is like a marriage, so I am told. Once you are in, you are in. Short of death nothing is going to get you released from your vows. Oh, you can go to Mole's Town and sample the delights there, or you can abscond north of the wall. But the watch is for life, it will haunt you should you ever leave. And you are a Stark despite what others say. You will never leave once you are in. You are too noble and honorable. You are not even a man yet, Jon Snow. You have your whole life ahead of you. Do not waste it here with rapists and murderers. You were not destined to die here," the dwarf said. Then he reached up and clapped Jon on the arm and walked away, back towards the lift. Jon sighed again and turned back to the haunted forest once the sound of the lift started. It all sounded so simple when Tyrion Lannister phrased it like that. When Maester Aemon phrased it like that. But what was he to do? He had been a bastard Stark all his life. Now he was a bastard Targaryen born of rape, the most heinous of crimes after kinslaying. He was never going to be Ned Stark's son. That had been made clear time and time again. When his father had not defended him from Lady Stark's scorn. When he had encouraged him to go to the wall without telling him what it was really like, for he must have known. He had shipped him off to die here because that was what Lady Stark wished. He turned his gaze further into the distance, trying to see the snow-topped peaks that he knew lay beyond the haunted forest. Standing here, on top of the world, able to see thousands of miles in any direction, it was easy to see why Benjen loved being a ranger. Jon felt freer and more alive up here than he had ever felt before. But could he feel that way elsewhere? He did not know. Winterfell and the wall were all he had ever seen of the world. He sighed again and wrapped his cloak tighter around his body. If he left before he swore his vows, he would still be considered without honor by everyone who knew him. If he swore his vows, then Tyrion was right, he would be bound for life and he would never leave even if he regretted it. This was not what he had imagined. However, he was not sure what he had imagined, given Benjen had never described the watch, only his experiences ranging. Just because it was not what he imagined, it did not mean it was not a cause worth serving. But, he did not belong here. He could feel it. He had felt it the moment he walked through the gates. He had not needed Maester Aemon or Tyrion Lannister to tell him he didn't belong here to know it. A howl in the distance caught his attention. His head snapped back to the haunted forest where the howl came from. Direwolf. He smiled as he leaned forward slightly, knowing that he would never be able to spot such an animal amongst all the trees, but finding himself drawn to the noise anyway. He was never going to be Ned Stark's son, not now, regardless of what decision he made. Not after all that had been revealed and not all that had happened to him whilst he lived at Winterfell and since he arrived at the Wall. He was never going to be Rhaegar Targaryen's son either. But that did not mean he was not a Stark, he had Ghost. And it did not mean he was not a Targaryen, he felt life in that egg. So, what did that make him? Tyrion Lannister suggested I come find you. He seemed to be of the opinion that you might throw yourself off the edge, a voice said gently. Jon started and spun on the spot. Benjen smiled at him, but his eyes did not move. They remained sad. Uncle Benjen, Jon said quietly. He cast his eyes around and realized they were alone at the top of the wall. Where is everyone? It's approaching time for the last meal of the day. I sent them down to get their food early. I thought you might want to talk, Benjen said as he walked to stand next to Jon. Jon adverted his attention back to the haunted forest. You knew and you never said, he said eventually when it became clear that his uncle was waiting for him to speak. I knew, came the quiet reply. Why did you not tell me? What good was there to be done in telling you? You were a child. This is not something a child should have to deal with. Ned and I agreed on that. And then, eventually I had waited too long, and I became too scared of what you might think. Of how you might feel about me. And Ned would not tell you, and I did not think you would believe me if Ned did not join our conversation, which he never would. And the years ticked by and, eventually, I thought it was for the best. I am not sure I ever would have told you if Aemon had not seen you and realized. It kept you safe, and I am not sorry for that. But I am sorry that I lied to you. It was not my decision, but I could have told you and I did not. I hate you. Less than I hate father, but I hate you. I wish you had told me. I can understand why you did not, but I hate you for it, he said, flexing his fingers to keep from rubbing his hands together. Then he sighed, but you are my uncle, so I also forgive you. Thank you, his uncle breathed out. Jon did not speak for a long moment. He kept his eyes on the forest and sucked in a breath of clean, crisp air. Did he tell you about the egg? He said after another long silence. His uncle flinched slightly. Jon smiled softly. I was probably not meant to tell you. But who else am I to talk to? You can always talk to me. I will always be here for you. I will always support you. And I will never tell anyone what we discuss. Jon turned to face him. His uncle's eyes were wet, and his gaze was fixed squarely on the haunted forest. He refused to turn and meet Jon's eyes, even when it became clear that Jon was hoping he would. I knew. The second I touched that egg I knew. It took Maester Aemon to say it for it to really register, but once he had said it out loud, I knew that I knew, he said after several more moments. I cannot describe it. It's nothing like how I feel with Ghost. It's more invasive. I held that egg, and I could feel everything. I could feel life in it, Uncle Benjen. It is alive. And once I realized I could feel life in it, I knew what that meant. It is alive. Benjen said softly. And she's waiting for me, Jon said, voice barely above a whisper. There was a sharp inhale next to him. Then Benjen heaved out a deep sigh. What will you do? I cannot stay here. And I cannot go home. I do not want to go to Essos. Maester Aemon said my aunt and uncle would welcome me, but I wouldn't welcome me if I were them. I am the proof of what Rhaegar did. I. But you are also blood. And what are the Targaryen words, Jon? Fire and blood. But you cannot be sure that blood means family. It could mean blood on the battlefield, or war or anything else similar. Jon bit back. I cannot. But there is someone you could ask. If I am wrong, I am wrong. But what if I am right? Will you throw away the chance at a good life because you were too prideful to ask? Benjen hissed back. Then he turned so abruptly to grab Jon by the shoulders that Jon flinched. You said you felt life in that egg, Jon. That she waits for you. She, Jon. Not it. She. Jon stared at him, even as his uncle's fingers dug into his shoulder that he was sure to have bruises in the morning. Oh. Benjen released Jon's shoulders abruptly and they both took a step back from each other at the same moment as their eyes met and they came to the same awful realization. The egg was going to hatch. Chapter 3, Inferno. Chapter text. Chapter summary, Aemon Targaryen meets the newest member of his family. Notes, everything goes pretty or, at least for Jon /Aemon, from this chapter onwards. The rest of the characters are still plodding along on their same path, i.e. Ned is busy killing Lady on his way to King's Landing, etc. 298 AC Aemon Targaryen. He knew he had not spoken in several minutes as he gazed unblinkingly at the boy in front of him. Jon Snow was hunched over on the chair in front of Aemon's desk, his head facing the floor and his hands gripping the arms of the chair. He looked half like a boy ready to burst into tears and a man ready to flee. Ghost was curled up on the floor by the boy's feet with his head on his paws staring up at his master with sad wide eyes. Aemon was reminded as though he needed reminded that Jon Snow was just a boy. Many would consider him a man, but Aemon had lived nearly 100 years and even a man twice Jon Snow's age was a boy to him. Aemon tore his eyes away from his many times removed great-nephew's body and gazed instead at the egg he held in his own hands. The life within it felt more vibrant than it ever had before. There was an increasingly sense of restlessness coming from within and growing more prominent the longer he held the egg. But try as he might, he could not feel anything else. You are sure that she is waiting for you? You are sure that is what you felt? He said eventually, only tearing his eyes from the egg to give Jon a quick glance. The boy nodded and hunched in further. Aemon returned his gaze to the egg. Aemon heaved out a sigh, oh dear. Jon's eyes snapped up at the same time that Aemon finally drew his gaze away from the egg for long enough to engage in a proper conversation. Their eyes met and Jon looked torn between laughing and crying. Oh dear, Maester Aemon. Is that all you can say? It seems like the most appropriate comment to make given the circumstances. Jon barked out a laugh and then said, what do I do? I cannot tell you. It is your choice to make, he replied gently. When Jon's eyes widened and the boy began to chew on his lip nervously, he said, but if you wish, I will listen whilst you talk. Sometimes just speaking it all out loud helps. And if you want me to help, you need only ask for it. But the decision is yours, Jon. If I leave her in there, I will never forgive myself. She's alive and waiting for me. She's always been destined to be mine. I can feel it, Maester Aemon, the boy said in a rush. Then he paused and inhaled deeply, but if I hatch her, I will become responsible for her. Balerion was rumored to be large enough to eat a mammoth whole. She could live for 200 years. I will likely not live to be 100. And yet, I know from just looking at this egg that dragons are tiny when they are born. She will not be able to protect herself for years. How am I meant to protect her from everyone who will wish her dead? Would it not be better to stay in that egg? She will go from needing to be protected by me to me trying to protect the world from her in the space of a few years. The thought terrifies me. Aemon regarded the boy carefully. It sounded like he did not wish for an answer, but the way that Jon Snow was looking at him told him that the boy needed an answer. Aemon sighed. The boy had not said as much, but he was still gazing at Aemon with impossibly wide eyes that were begging for guidance. What if it were you? Imagine for a moment that someone had been given the option of choosing your life for you. You could live the life you have lived, or you could have never been born. Those were the choices that person could make for you. If you could make them choose, what would you have wanted them to pick? Jon stared at him then said with a small smile on his face, I would choose life. Despite everything that has happened these last few days and my life so far, I would choose life. Why? I guess because it is better to experience life than not to. Then you have answered your own question, Jon Snow. The boy sighed. I do not think it was ever a question. I cannot leave her there. Aemon nodded. He had already known that. The tugging and emotions he felt from the egg were strong. If Jon was destined for this egg, it must be taking him an enormous amount of strength to not hatch it. He was a stronger man than Aemon, for the tugging that Aemon was experiencing was making him want to try and hatch the egg himself. So, what will you do? I will open the chest and then I will hatch her. Aemon nodded. Very well. Would you like me to leave? The boy shook his head. Please stay. Then he said in a quiet voice that Aemon barely heard, you are family. I want you here. Aemon felt tears fill his eyes and hastily chewed his lip as he made to blink them away. It had been so long since he had heard that word. He held Jon's egg out to him, and the boy took it carefully and then placed it gently in the fire that was roaring inside the fireplace. The boy turned back and returned to where Aemon sat. Aemon moved slightly on his bed so that Jon could pull the chest out. Dust flew up into the boy's face as it had the day before with Aemon, but the boy did not seem fazed. The carvings. Did you do them? Aemon shook his head. No. It was my mother's. She died just after my 10th name day. You were close. Yes. My eldest brothers were nearly men when she died, and my younger siblings were still children. I was old enough to know what her death meant but young enough that I grieved her. My father, a prickly and impatient man, thought that, if I had something of hers, it would stop my tears. It did not. But it helped. Jon ran his hands over the carvings again. The carvings are of dragons and flames. Aemon smiled, her wedding gift from her parents. My parents were young when they married, and she was heading to King's Landing. She was 5 and 10. They could not send her with carvings of falling stars and of dawn. It would not have been proper given she was to marry a prince. Things were done differently then, and a wife did not adhere too strongly to her original house. Once she married, it was for life, and as such her old family was no longer her family. So, they had a birch, one of the few trees that is specific to Dornfeld, and a chest created with these carvings put on it. The carvings honor her marriage to House Targaryen, but the chest itself, all Dorne. To remind her of home. She used to tell me stories of Dorne. Of how she would chase her brothers underneath birch trees outside Starfall as children. Of how when they built funeral pyres all the wood on it would be birch, and the smell that the birch trees gave off would hide the scent of burning bodies. She loved Dorne. You were close, Jon said in an almost envious voice. My eldest brother had already proved himself to be a disappointment by the time I was born, and my second brother was already cruel and vicious. I was different. I was smaller. Weaker. She spent more time with me than my other siblings because of it. And as I grew older, the differences between my eldest brothers and I became more pronounced, and I grew up quickly. So yes, I suppose you could say we were very close. Jon looked up from the chest and smiled at him. You brought it with you. To the war. We were not meant to bring anything of home with us. The life of a man of the Night's Watch is a frugal one. But I am a Targaryen. I was given special privileges at the time. Jon smiled more wryly, but not anymore. But not anymore. No one at the Watch now, except you and Benjen, has ever spoken to me of my Targaryen heritage. And you do not talk to them. Aemon shook his head. It has been too painful. Jon nodded and turned his attention back to the chest. There was a brief pause as he ran his hands across the lid. Then he heaved in a deep breath and lifted the lid carefully up and over until it lay fully back on its hinges, exposing the contents of the chest to Aemon and Jon. Aemon leaned forward expectantly. Drawings. Jon said reverently as he picked up the top scraps of paper from the chest. My mother, Aemon said softly, trying to blink more tears away. She was very good, Jon remarked quietly. Aemon nodded but did not speak as Jon ran the fingers of one of his hands over the lines of the first drawing. His brother, Aegon's, face stared back at him. Young, still a child, and just as Aemon remembered. Deep purple eyes, white golden hair, a boyish grin on his face. But it was not the boy in the drawing that had Eamon wanting to cry, it was the way that Jon Snow was running his fingers over the lines that made up Aegon's eyes. Jon breathed quietly. Eamon smiled, yes. Jon carefully leaned forwards and put the top drawing down, face up, on the bed next to Eamon. He turned his attention to the next drawing. Your father? Yes. Jon ran his hands over the lines of the drawing, as he had done with the previous ones. Eamon watched his fingers as they moved and traced the lines that made up the stubble of the beard his father had, the light violet eyes and the strong set jaw. Was he a good father? Eamon sighed, he was not a bad father. When Jon looked up at him, clearly wanting more of an explanation, he said, he loved my mother and he loved all his children, even my brother Aerion, who was deeply troubled. He did not suffer fools and he was prickly. He valued strength as all great warriors do. I disappointed him, I think. I was not a warrior, and I was not strong. I preferred to read than to spar. But he loved me. He was not a cruel or a bad father. He just did not know what to do with children, particularly one who did not have any interests that mirrored his. My father was never meant to be king, as you know. He was a fourth son. As my brother, Egg, was. Fourth sons are not meant to be king. They marry for love. Everything they do for love, or lust, or glory, or because they wish to. They do not do it for any other reason. When my father became king, he was not ready. He summoned me back to King's Landing. He wanted me on the small council. He wanted my council. Mine. The son who had disappointed him the most. He sought me out and I said no, I could not risk upsetting the citadel by sitting on the same small council as the Grand Maester. So, I turned my back on him. He sought me out for advice and to have me close, and I said no, and I went to Dragonstone instead. I will never forgive myself for that. So much could have been different if I had stayed. That was the second time I failed House Targaryen, Aemon said softly, as a tear slipped down his cheek. Was he a good king? He was tormented by his past and the death of his brother, an accident that he blamed himself from the day his brother died, until the last day I saw him and likely until he died. He was a good fighter and a good king from what I remember. He was not kind or patient, but many skirmishes littered the realm during his life despite the realm mostly being at peace, and his skills on the battlefield made his men love him and fight for him. There are few who manage to gain glory in battle and have the patience to rule. The two things are at odds with each other. So, yes. I would say he was a good king. Then you did not fail him or House Targaryen, Jon Snow said softly, and he reached out from his position on the floor and put a hand gently on Aemon's leg. Aemon looked up from the floor to meet Jon's eyes. What makes you say that? He was your father and your king. He could have forced you to stay in King's Landing to serve him. But he let you go, Jon said quietly. Then he smiled and repeated, he let you go. It is kind of you to say that. Jon did not say anything but withdrew his hand and carefully put the drawing of Maker Eye on the bed next to the one of Egg. He turned to the next drawing. Aerion, Aemon said softly. Bright flame. Yes. He was troubled. Both my brothers and my sisters hated him. No one mourned him when he died, Aemon replied. That is sad. Yes. To be alive for 40 years and not have a single family member mourn your death when you go, sad is the right word, he said softly, staring at the drawing of his brother. What was he like? Insane. Worse than your grandfather. Cruel and vicious. A compulsive liar. Arrogant and incompetent. But still family, Jon said softly. Still family. You said your siblings did not mourn him. Did you? He was my brother. I did not mourn him for what he was. But I mourned him for what he could have been, Aemon said, eyes still fixed on the carefully lines that made up his brother's nose, the same nose that Jon Snow had. Jon put the drawing of Aerion carefully on the bed and turned to the next one. You. Yes. I could tell. Mayhaps it is because you said you were close, but this drawing is different. There is more life in the lines, it just feels more alive, as strange as that sounds, Jon said quietly. He turned his eyes from the drawing up to Aemon's. Can I keep them? Of course. Jon smiled but did not say anything, his eyes were back to staring at the drawings. He flicked through the last few, of Eamon's sisters and his eldest brother, but did not say anything, for the children in the drawing were barely babes and the drawing of Daron was half finished. There was nothing of note in them. He carefully leaned forward again to put the remainder of the drawings on the bed. Eamon watched as John's attention returned to the chest. His hands moved over the blanket that was next. "That is padding, it is not of significance," Eamon said as John opened his mouth to ask what the blanket was. John's eyes flashed up to his and a smile played about his lips. "Not a family heirloom." "No, I borrowed it from Eastwatch when I arrived at the watch." John barked out a laugh, eyes bright. "Borrowed is a nice way to describe a theft, Maester Eamon," he remarked, grinning up at Eamon. Eamon smiled back. "It is what is under the blanket that is important." John lifted the blanket tentatively. His eyes widened and then he pulled the top of the blanket off completely. "Another one," he breathed out, silently. Eamon nodded. "My brother, Daron's." John leaned forward and reached into the chest and pulled out the egg within. It was smaller than Eamon's had been. It had always been smaller, but in the flickering of the firelight, Eamon was surprised to see just how much smaller the egg was. Although he had not gazed upon it for years, he had not remembered it being quite so small, almost half the size of his. He wondered for half a second why he, the third-born son, had been given an egg larger than his brother's and then tucked the thought away for another day. The egg was beautiful, grey and gold. Its scales sparkled in the firelight. Although he knew that the color of dragon's egg reflected the dragon in and was not, despite what many had believed, anything to do with the dragon that had laid the egg, he did wonder whether his egg and his brother's might have been from the same clutch. Grey was, after all, a fairly distinctive color. "Why do you have it, Daron?" "He had dreams," Eamon breathed out. His eyes widening as he remembered what his brother had said, and he laughed. "He had dreams of dragons returning. I laughed at him at the time. I laughed at so much he said he was so strange. Drunk most of the time and spewing what he believed to be prophecy the rest of the time. I never believed him. But mayhaps he was right in this. Before he died, he begged me to take his egg. He had given it to his daughter, Viola, hoping that it would hatch for her. But it never did. She was a simple girl. Even if dragons had still lived in Westeros when she was born, I doubt she would have been capable taking one for her mount. He said that the egg was destined to hatch. That he had dreamt that dragons would return. That all his siblings' eggs would hatch. That we would not have to wait another century and that they would be reborn. He said that dragons would return to the world and House Targaryen would rise anew." He laughed again, bright and breathy. Then he leaned forwards. "What do you feel? Do you feel the same thing you did with my egg?" John turned his eyes back to the egg and then he closed them. He breathed in deeply and his brow furrowed. "I feel life. But not in the same way as I do with your egg," he finally replied, after several moments of silence. He opened his eyes and gazed sadly at the egg. "Anything more?" "Nothing. Just life." "May I?" Eamon asked, leaning forwards with his hands out. John said nothing, but practically hurled the egg at Eamon and, after a brief pause, whispered, "What do you feel, uncle?" Eamon's eyes widened. But he quickly relaxed his face back into its previous expression. He would not react. Could not react. He stared at the egg in his hands. "Nothing." John huffed out a breath. "Why do I feel something, but you do not?" "There are several possible reasons," Eamon said, lifting his eyes to stare at John. He handed the egg back to him gently. "The first one is that the rider of this dragon could likely be one of your descendants and I am too far removed to feel anything. The second is that, if this egg had hatched years ago it would never have been destined for me, even if it had been riderless and I had tried to claim it. But you might have had some luck. Dragons are strange creatures. There is much we don't know about them, including why they picked the riders they did, because, make no mistake, it was dragons who picked us." He sighed and then said, "I spent years wondering if whether the reason dragons died out and did not hatch from the eggs House Targaryen had been because we were not good enough. That there was something within everyone born to House Targaryen that the dragons did not like. Like a sickness. It would be nice to think that dragons are intelligent enough, even before hatching, to understand what those who hold them are like and to refuse to hatch until the right people came along. But what do you think it is?" I think that dragons are always destined for particular riders. They might accept others both before and after, but I do not believe those bonds were as powerful. Look at Balerion and Aegon. Balerion took riders for years after Aegon died, but none were able to recreate the partnership that Aegon had with him. Caraxes and Aemon is another example. Caraxes accepted Aemon as his rider, but they never achieved the heights of closeness that Caraxes did with Daemon. It is said that even though Daemon rode with a saddle and a whip as all the dragon riders of old did, that he never had to force Caraxes to do what he wished, that they rode as one. A true partnership. Jon nodded absently. He turned slightly, facing slightly away from the trunk and Aemon, and his eyes fixed back on his dragon egg in the fireplace. How do you hatch a dragon egg? My father used to say that a dragon would hatch when it was ready. That you could not force a dragon to do anything it did not want. So, I wait. Aemon nodded. Flames should be enough, I think. But yes, you wait. Jon turned back slightly and gave him a wry grin. With my luck I could be waiting until winter arrives. I do not think you will need to wait that long. I would be surprised if it took more than a day of the egg sitting in the flames. But you just said that it would hatch when it's ready. You said that the egg felt impatient. If I were an egg that had waited at least a century and a half for my rider to find me, I would not sit around in my egg waiting to be born for another century, he remarked blandly. Oh. I will put this egg here, he said softly as he put the egg he was still holding gently on the bed next to him. Jon's eyes turned back to the chest. He leaned back over and fully removed the blanket. Dark Sister, Aemon said quietly when Jon reared back from the chest, shock spreading across his face. Brynden Rivers brought it with him to the wall almost 70 years ago. My brother sent him here, you know. Brynden served my father as Hand of the King, my uncle as Hand of the King, and my grandfather before him. He was a good hand and loyal to House Targaryen from his first breath until his last. People called him a kinslayer for what he did for House Targaryen during the Blackfyra Rebellion. How easily they forget that Daemon Blackfyra might have been his bastard half-brother, but Daeron Targaryen too was his true-born half-brother. I wonder, it better to be a kinslayer of your true-born kin in the eyes of the gods, or the kinslayer of your bastard kin? Neither. One's worth is not measured by whether or not they are a bastard, Jon said softly, eyes fixed in the chest. Quite so. Brynden Rivers was no coward and he had to pick a side. He picked the side where the better man would be king. Daemon Blackfyra was not a cruel man, Jon Snow. Indeed, he was intelligent and brave, kind and fierce. The histories and Maestas will tell you otherwise. But he was a fool. He started a rebellion because he was not allowed to marry the woman he loved. A man like that should not be king. A king cannot burn the world to the ground just because they cannot have what they want most. The man Brynden Rivers chose to support instead was my grandfather. Daeron II Targaryen. Daeron the Good, they called him. And he was a good king and a good man. He died the year my mother died. Were you close? Not especially. I was the third son of a fourth son. But I remember him being loved and I remember my childhood being a time of peace. And Brynden Rivers was his hand. Yes. He was. Hand to 3 kings. Even my father, who during his youth hated him. What does that tell you about him? That he was respected, Jon said quietly. And why am I telling you this? Because he was a bastard, like me. Yes. We cannot know the circumstances of your birth, and although I am loath to believe Rhaegar as I am any man capable of what he did, until there is proof, we cannot call you anything else or pretend different, Aemon said gently. Then he smiled, even though Jon could not see it for he was still staring in the chest, but, the other reason I tell you is to make it clear that Bloodraven, as he became, was not a bad man. He was a Targaryen loyalist until his last day. That is why when he came to the wall he came with Dark Sister. He did not smuggle her out of King's Landing. He wore her proudly. He was gifted her for all his services to the house. That he ended up here is something I will never understand. He did not resent it. He chose to come here. Many believed my brother gave him no choice, but I knew my brother better than I know my right hand. He would not have forced a man here against his will. So, Brynden Rivers came here through his own choice. He became Lord Commander, as you know. And he was a ranger as well. Yet, on his last ranging he left Dark Sister with me. I shall not need it where I go. Take care of it, Eamon, until the right man comes along. You will know him when you see him, he said. And so, I have taken care of it for over 40 years. You think he meant me? Who else could he have meant? You are the last of my kin in Westeros. You are a great swordsman already. You have the ability to become one of the best. I have already told you that Targaryens have prophetic dreams. It is possible that he knew you were destined to come here. It is also entirely possible that he was just saying whatever came into his mind. Jon cracked a wry smile. Then his eyes finally left the sword and he said, "Can I?" Eamon nodded, "Of course." Jon clambered to his feet and bent down to the chest. Then he gently pulled Dark Sister out of the chest, one hand on the end of the scabbard and one on the hilt. He moved his hand, so it rested flat under the hilt of the blade and shifted it slightly, so the hilt moved backwards and forwards on his palm. "It's so light," he breathed. "Valyrian steel." Jon took another step back and glanced at Eamon, who nodded, then he pulled the blade free of the scabbard. The steel seemed to ripple as it was pulled free, and the light from the fireplace caught on the blade and made patterns that flickered around the room. Jon held the blade out in front of him for a moment and then moved it closer to him, taking a small half-step back as he did so. He smiled sheepishly at Eamon, "Much lighter than any sword I have ever held. I thought for a moment I may cut myself." His gaze returned to the sword, and he murmured quietly, even as his eyes ran the length of the blade, "It's beautiful. A woman's blade," Brynden used to say. He said it was made for those who are lighter and smaller than the average man. Many men would struggle to wield it well given how light it is and how narrow it is, Eamon said. Then he smiled as Jon moved the blade slightly to the side. "It will suit you, I think. You are a fast mover. I watched you spar with your uncle the other day." Jon ripped his eyes away from the sword again and smiled at Eamon. He sheathed it and then settled back down on the floor and placed the sword next to him. Ghost nudged it with his nose and then rested his head over the top of the hilt as though guarding it. Eamon smiled at the movement. They fell into a companionable silence. Jon staring at Ghost and the sheath of Dark Sister and Eamon watching him closely. "I called you uncle earlier," Jon said quietly, eyes fixed on the sword. "You did," Eamon replied after a brief pause. "Can I call you uncle again?" Jon said quietly, sounding like a small boy scared of rejection. "I would like that very much," Eamon said, so quietly he barely heard what he'd said. Tears welled in his eyes, and he hastily blinked them away. Jon's eyes removed from the floor to lock with Eamon's. Eamon smiled weakly at him, even as he tried desperately to blink more tears away. Through his teary eyes he watched as Jon seemed to struggle with something for a moment. Then he rose to his feet carefully. He paused and then he crossed the small space between where he had been settled on the floor by the chest and the bed where Eamon sat. It was less than a full step, but it seemed to take Jon an age to cross the space. He sat down next to Eamon on the bed, being careful to avoid the egg that rested there. Then he wrapped his arms around Eamon. "Thank you, uncle." Eamon turned slightly so he was facing Jon more than the chest and wrapped his arms tightly around Jon and whispered back, "Nephew." ****. Several hours later the sun had set and, other than the flickering of the candlelight in Eamon's chambers and the light from the fire, the room was mostly clouded in darkness. Benjen Stark had come and gone with dinner for the two of them. "I have told them Jon is thinking of becoming a maester and that you are explaining the ailments and aches that you have dealt with in all your years as a maester. He can understand how hard a diagnosis can be and the level of work it will entail." Eamon had thanked the gods very briefly for the brain cells that Benjen possessed, for neither he nor Jon had thought about any justification for why the boy was spending so much time with him. Eamon was in bed, wrapped up under his blankets, and Jon Snow sat at the edge of his bed staring into the flames from the fireplace. The chest and its contents were tucked back under the bed, and the only sign that anything was different to how it would have been a moon ago, other than the presence of Jon Snow, was the egg in the fire. "Uncle," Jon said quietly, as though worried that Eamon had drifted off to sleep and he had disturbed him. He did not turn his gaze from the fireplace. "Yes, nephew." "Can you feel her?" Eamon adjusted himself slightly in his bed, so he was sitting up a bit straighter. "No, I have only ever been able to sense anything when I held the egg. I could not feel anything earlier when I was not touching the egg. But I can now," Jon said softly. Eamon bolted upright, his bones creaking in protest. He sat up in bed, all weariness gone from his bones. "You feel her?" he breathed out. Yes, John said so quietly that if Eamon had still been laying in his bed instead of sitting bolt upright practically touching, he wouldn't have heard him. Eamon heaved out a deep breath. "It is time then." John's eyes ripped from the fireplace and settled on his own. Panic spread over his face. Eamon reached out to put his hand gently on his nephew's. Then he smiled down as he felt Ghost's snout rest on top of his hand, pinning it to John's. John relaxed slightly, but he still wore a panicked look on his face, as though ready to bolt from the room and never come back. "You think you are not ready?" Eamon murmured. "Do you think Rhaenyra Targaryen was ready when her son was murdered, and the dance truly began?" "No, she was not, but she had no choice." "Do you think your father was ready when he held you in his arms for the first time?" "No, but he was likely not, but he had no choice." "Do you think your uncle Viserys was when he had to leave his life behind as a boy of 9? "No, he almost certainly was not, but he had no choice." "Then you have me." "I had a choice when I left my family, just as you do now. I was still not ready. Let me tell you a secret, Jon Snow. No matter what life throws at you, you will never be ready. But this egg. This is the smallest challenge you will ever face. She has waited at least a century and a half for you, Jon Snow. You have already decided what path you will take. You know what you wish to do. So why do you feel you are not ready?" "I haven't decided my path. I haven't decided anything, uncle." Jon cried out, tears of frustration starting to appear in his eyes. "I am not ready." Eamon smiled sadly at him as Ghost lifted his snout off his hand. "Yes, you have. You decided what to do the day you first held her egg," he said gently. Then he sighed and said quietly, "You were never going to be ready. But if you can feel her from here, then it is time. I am afraid you have no choice." Eamon removed his hands and settled them back on top of the blanket over his lap. He peered carefully at Jon. Now was the moment he would see if his house could be saved. Jon's eyes still stared into his own. Eamon smiled gently at him. Then, Jon Snow straightened his spine and rose. Then he crossed the room. Eamon followed him at a slower pace. Old he might be, but he could not and would not miss this. Jon settled down so he was sat crossed-legged in front of the fireplace, back straight and so close that the flames were practically touching his legs as they whipped up out and over the side of the egg. "What do I do? I do not know. Wild dragons hatched naturally in the heat of Dragonstone, and our ancestors never wrote down how they might have hatched the dragons that were in cribs," Eamon said quietly. "Fire and blood," Jon murmured quietly. Eamon turned his eyes from the flame to his nephew, who was gazing fixedly on the egg. He turned back and hobbled to his desk where he withdrew a letter knife. He gave it one long look before he headed back to where Jon sat. Then, he stuck the knife in the flames over the egg. Jon flinched. "I will not have you cut yourself with a dirty blade and risk death from some nasty disease just to test a theory," Eamon bit out as Jon seemed to lift an involuntary hand to take the letter knife from him. Jon's eyes turned to him, and he gave Eamon a baleful look. Eamon smiled at him, and, once satisfied that the blade was as sterile as it was going to get, moved his fingers up the handle so that he was only gripping the very tip of the handle. Jon's hand shot out quickly and grasped the rest of the handle. "You believe this is what you should do?" "I think so," Jon replied, eyes fixed on the egg again, the letter knife dangling in the flames just above it. Eamon sighed but said nothing. He watched carefully as Jon held his other hand out over the egg, slightly under the knife, and turned his palm upwards. There was a deep intake of breath, and then Jon slashed the knife over his palm. Blood gushed from the wound and Eamon lurched forward. It was too much blood. But he stopped when Jon shook his head. His nephew dropped the letter knife on the floor by the fireplace and Eamon carefully moved it to one side, out the way, but still within reach. Jon turned his hand, so his palm was facing down, and then he clenched his fingers into a fist. Blood poured from the wound over the egg in the flames. Eamon watched carefully as the blood flooded onto the egg and down its sides. He blinked. Then he leaned further forwards until he could feel the heat of the flames licking around his face as the flames roared higher, far higher than they had before. Blood continued to drip from John's fist onto the egg until the egg seemed to be completely covered in a thin layer of dried blood. They stayed there for an age, John sitting in front of the fire, his hand in the flames, blood pouring from it, and Eamon next to him, staring expectantly. Eventually, the flow of blood stopped. John heaved out a deep sigh and turned away from the flames to look up at Eamon. Tears glistened in his eyes, but they remained unshed. "I suppose I was not destined to hatch her. Or she will surprise us and wake in the morning. Or in a week. Or a moon. Dragons are creatures of magic. They will do things when they are ready. Mayhaps she was destined for you all along," Uncle John said in a matter-of-fact tone of voice. Eamon was not fooled though. The tears that John had been trying to hold in were pouring down his face. Even as the boy tried to keep them away. Eamon carefully averted his eyes. He knew it was not that the egg had not hatched that was causing his nephew pain. No, it was that once again Jon Snow felt like an outsider. The boy had felt that this egg could be his redemption, proof that he did have family and that he belonged to someone. He was not crying because he was sad, he was crying because he was disappointed and alone, again. Eamon stared thoughtfully at the egg that had been his since he was a child. "I wonder," murmured Eamon. He bent down gently, eyes still on the roaring flames, and the egg nestled within and groped around for the knife. Once he had grasped it in his hand, he took a deep breath, much like John had an hour before, and cut his palm. He dropped the knife onto the floor with a loud clatter and leaned forward, his bleeding palm clenched. Blood dripped onto the egg and merged with the dried blood that was already there. John let out an intake of breath, finally taking his eyes off the egg, and turned to stare at Eamon in horror. "Uncle. There was no point both of us wasting our blood and energy for naught." Eamon ignored him but kept his eyes fixed firmly on the egg. Eventually the dripping slowed and then stopped. He removed his hand from the flames and turned away from the flames. He hastened to his desk and grabbed some gauze and water along with a small bowl. He headed back to John and settled down on the floor with some difficulty next to his nephew. He did not speak as he carefully washed John's palm and wrapped it up in the bandage. Then he did his own. Once finished, he pushed the bowl to one side, next to the fireplace, and gazed into the flames with his nephew. "Give her time, nephew," he said quietly. "She will come when she is ready." John nodded and did not turn from the flames. Eamon felt a gently nudging from behind him and he turned slightly, not taking his own eyes off the flames. Ghost nudged him again and he shifted over to make room between himself and John. He finally pulled his eyes away from the egg as Ghost settled down between them, resting his head on John's lap with his blood-red eyes fixed on the flames. Eamon was not sure how long they had sat there. But by the time Ghost let out a low whine, hours later, the lights from the candles around the room had all gone out. Eamon blinked, his eyes felt heavy, and he struggled to get them to open again. Ghost whined again. Next to Eamon there was a rustle as John moved even close to the fireplace. "Uncle, look." Eamon whipped his head around to gaze into the fireplace. The egg wobbled briefly, and John leaned forward to prise it from the flames. The boy gasped as he brought the egg closer, and Eamon felt a moment of terror, believing that the fool of a child had burnt his hand beyond repair, but then he realized that John was gasping because the egg had a crack in it. "Do you think I can?" John said quietly, not taking his eyes off the egg that rested in his lap. He sounded like a little boy asking for permission. Yet he did not wait as he removed one hand from cradling the egg and used two fingers to gently pull a piece of shell away. Eamon watched as the shell fell to the ground and tore his eyes from it to look at the egg. A tongue darted out, forked and tiny but alive. She was alive. Eamon inhaled sharply. He had truly thought the egg would hatch, but seeing it happen, seeing and knowing that the creature within was alive, was as heartbreakingly sad as it was joyful. All these years she had been trapped in there, waiting and alone. But not anymore. Now she could taste the air on her tongue and would soon be able to feel the air beneath her wings. He smiled. Once the first bit of shell was free and her tongue had darted out, the rest of her seemed eager to follow. Her tongue vanished from the hole John had created and suddenly her whole snout pushed up and through. The rest of the egg shattered into pieces around Jon Snow, and Eamon watched as the dragon within sought to uncurl herself and try to stand. Her leathery wings unfolded, small and delicate, but intact, and Eamon knew without having to look any further that she would be able to fly. She was magnificent. Her entire body was grey from the tip of her snout all the way down to the end of the tail that was still curled around her. Tiny little spikes went from the tip of her tail all the way up new neck to the top of her head. But it was not just one row of spikes but two, equal distance apart with her spine nestled in between. Her spikes were completely grey as well, the same grey as the house Stark banners. The very tips of them were as white as the snow that Eamon knew lay on the mountains beyond the wall. As she tried to stand, Eamon noted that her feet were white as well, but her legs were the same grey. Her wings opened and then closed, the same grey as the rest of her. She let out a tiny shriek that sounded more like a cat's cry, and he cried out a laugh. Her eyes fixed on him, and he froze and stopped laughing. Her eyes were white. There was no color to them, they were completely white. He raised his hand and watched as she followed the movement of his fingers as he danced them back and forth in front of her face. "What are you doing, uncle?" Jon asked, finally looking away from his dragon to see what had caught her attention. Her eyes. "I thought she might be blind," he murmured. And it was true, he had thought that she was blind. There had been some small part of him that worried that, after the last dragon had died so weak and feeble and young, that this one would have some defect. But she did not. She had followed the movement of his fingers so carefully. He turned his attention from her to Jon and met his nephew's eyes. "She is not. She is perfect." Jon smiled at him. A blinding smile that for an instant made him look just like Egg. A loud huff caught their attention. Eamon jumped slightly, as Ghost lifted up his head from where it had been resting on the floor. Eamon watched with interest as the direwolf stretched his leg forward, the rest of his body not moving, and gave the dragon a good sniff. The dragon squawked again. Ghost huffed out what appeared to be a derisive snort and dropped his head back to the ground. Eamon stared at him in faint bafflement. "I must confess I had expected more of a reaction than that." Jon smiled at him again. "Ghost is different. He understands that she is important, just like he is." Eamon nodded and turned his attention back to the dragon on his nephew's lap. Even as he watched, the dragon turned away from him and gazed up at Jon. It let out another noise and bared white teeth at Jon. "What's wrong?" Jon asked, worry seeping into his tone. "She is hungry, and you need to feed her," Eamon said. Jon laughed. "Good that I did not eat all my stew. How much do you think she eats?" "Anything you will give her." Jon carefully put the dragon on the ground and rose to his feet. Then he crossed the room and headed to the plates of food that Benjen had brought in for their dinner and had been left untouched whilst they spoke. He was back nearly instantly, but, in the time he was gone, the dragon had wobbled over from its position on the floor to where Eamon kneeled on the floor and was in the process of trying to clamber onto his legs. Jon sat down next to Eamon just as the dragon managed to scrabble its way into Eamon's lap. It was barely 2 steps the dragon had taken, and yet it seemed to exhaust the creature. It practically collapsed into Eamon's lap, and he smiled it. Very carefully he lifted one of his hands and, ensuring that he moved it in front of the dragon's eyes so she could see the movement, started to rub one finger down the gap between her 2 lines of spines. She let out a noise that sounded like a purr and seemed to snuggle in deeper. "How did you do that?" Jon said quietly. Eamon looked up at his nephew, half expecting to see anger or annoyance on the boy's face. Instead, Jon looked intrigued and happy. His eyes were almost sparkling in excitement. Eamon smiled at him. This was the most alive Jon Snow had looked since he had met the boy. "She is a baby. Only a few minutes old. All babes want the same thing, food and love. You were getting her the food, so she just wanted love," he replied. He made to slip a hand under the dragon to give her back to Jon. "No. Let her stay there," his nephew replied before Eamon could even lift the dragon. His eyes softened even more as he looked at the dragon that was purring contentedly in Eamon's lap. "She was yours before she was mine." Eamon smiled at him. "You will need to name her. We cannot call her she forever. I do not know any female Targaryen names except Visenya, Rhaenys and Daenerys. I cannot call her the last 2. Eamon nodded. "She does not need a Targaryen name. The name will come to you eventually, be it a week from now or a year from now. Just know that she cannot remain, she forever." The dragon in question let out a squawk. Eamon watched as Jon carefully dangled a piece of cold venison from his fingers only a few inches from her snout. The dragon eyed it for half a second before she lunged forward and swallowed it whole. John laughed and Eamon joined him. Their laughter echoed around the small room. Suddenly John turned serious, even as he continued to feed the dragon. I will not be able to stay here now. She will soon grow too big to be here, and I won't cage her, he said quietly, his eyes fixed on the dragon. Next to him, Ghost heaved out a huff. A few more weeks. This room will be big enough for her for the moment. No one comes in here except me and now you. She will be safe. And you can stay in this room as much as you wish, and, when she is too big, you will tell the Lord Commander that you are leaving, that you do not think the life of the Night's Watch is for you and instead think you will forge your chain at the Citadel. You have not sworn your vows and you can leave at any time. And when the time comes for you to leave, you will leave and not look back, Eamon said as he resumed running a finger between the spines on the dragon's back. I don't know where I will go, John said quietly. Anywhere. You can go anywhere you wish, Eamon replied. John nodded, then clearly because he couldn't help himself, he said, how did you know to use your own blood as well? Eamon considered the question carefully for a moment. The dragon, sensing that there might be more food with John than Eamon, rose on spindly little legs and half fell off his lap. John scooped it up seemingly without thinking and settled it down in his lap. He kept his eyes on Eamon as he dipped his fingers into the bowl of cold stew and lifted bits of venison out for his dragon. She was my egg for nearly 100 years, nephew. She may not have hatched for me, but she was mine. I felt life in her, as you did. I always did. It is not so surprising that she wanted blood from both of us to hatch. So, the other egg. Destined for your children or your grandchildren, I would imagine. I did not feel life in it. But you did, but not as much as with her. It will likely require blood from you and them to hatch, if I had to guess, Eamon said quietly. Then he heaved out a sigh, but I cannot be sure. House Targaryen never wrote down anything about this, believe me, nephew. I have read all the books the scholars of our house wrote and all the books the Maesters wrote. I have books in that chest that you saw that are solely on dragons. They are the only copies in the world and they do not say anything about how to hatch a dragon. This is all guesswork. There was a brief pause and then John said quietly, I will have children. His eyes never moved from the dragon. He did not comment on the rest of Eamon's speech. I imagine that is in your future, yes. John tore his eyes away from the dragon in his lap to gaze up at Eamon, tears streaming down his eyes. Thank you. Eamon smiled gently at John. So what will you do now? If you are willing, I will learn all that you are willing to teach me. And then I will go to the northern mountains. The ranges there are extensive. If we are cautious, we will not encounter any clan men. Ghost will keep us safe until she is big enough to look after herself. And then? I have not got that far. But, one day she will be big enough that I cannot hide her. That could be a few years, or it could be 20. But when that day comes, I will not sit by and let anyone harm her. She is as much a part of me as Ghost is, John said softly, his fingers rubbing gently on his dragon's head as it nudged at his hand for more food. Eamon nodded, his eyes fixed on the dragon that was leaning into John's touch. I will teach you everything I know. You will need allies. Thank you, uncle. I know I am not a Targaryen, but that she has hatched for me gives me hope that one day I might do our house proud. That one day I might bring my aunt and uncle home and that we can be a family. Eamon leaned forward quickly. He pulled his John's hands away from his dragon, who squawked loudly in annoyance, and held them tightly. He stared at John until his nephew's eyes met his own and then he said forcefully, you would be a Targaryen with or without her. Without or without Dark Sister. With or without my brother's egg. With or without the contents of the chest. With or without Targaryen banners. Objects are not what make you a Targaryen, blood is. Brynden Rivers proved that, just as you will. You have always been a Targaryen, just as you have always been a Stark. Never forget that, Jon Snow. Eamon smiled as Jon Snow the boy seemed to vanish before his eyes. When he had arrived in Eamon's room earlier that week, he had been a boy on the verge of manhood. Eamon had watched all week as Jon Snow the boy battled with Jon Snow the man. But the boy was gone. Now Jon Snow was a man ready to make his mark on the world. Chapter 4, Love. Chapter Text. Chapter Summary, Jon leaves Castle Black and 2 Ravens head south. In our interlude, Jon receives another lesson from his uncle. Notes. Each chapter where Jon has a POV will have an interlude at the end from Maester Aemon's POV and will likely be linked to something, event/decision/though process, that has happened in the chapter from Jon's POV, although some flashbacks will instead be flashbacks to key events in Aemon's life. Given we are skipping a 3-moon period, roughly, a lot will be said/done that is referenced in later interludes, so if something seems strange, please do ask and I'll try and clarify in the comments or flag if it comes up later in the story. There was an error in a previous chapter about when Maester Aemon's vows had been tested. This has now been corrected, apologies. Finally, bonus points to whoever works out what the letter actually says. 298 AC Jon Snow. He did not look back as the south gate of Castle Black closed behind him. He could not. Not now and not ever. In one of his saddlebags, the dragon let out a tiny squawk and a huff of smoke emerged from a gap followed by a snout. He leaned forward carefully and gently shoved the dragon's south back inside the saddlebag. As soon as they were out of sight of Castle Black he would open the bag, but not before. Another squawk pierced the air and Jon sent a thank you to the gods that the dragon sounded somewhere between a dove and a raven at her current again. Then something latched around his finger. He did his best not to flinch, conscious he was still only a few feet away from Castle Black, and instead withdrew his hand and patted his horse's neck. Then he had a quick look at his finger. Blood. He smiled slightly. She was becoming ferocious. He had wanted to stay longer in Castle Black. He didn't want to leave either of his uncles. He didn't want to be alone again. But he had no choice, she was growing too quickly, and her behavior was getting worse. Uncle Aemon had been right when he said that dragons were not made for confinement. The 3 moons he had spent at the wall was both the worst and best time of his life, and he was loath to leave it behind. He straightened up and kicked his horse into a trot. Next to him, Ghost picked up speed. He knew the path he was taking well, he had mapped it multiple times with both uncles over the last few weeks. He would leave the King's Road as soon as Castle Black had disappeared from sight. All there thought he was heading back to Winterfell and then onwards to King's Landing and, once he had spoken to his father eventually, the Citadel. So, he would play the game and let them think that until he was out of sight, then he would vanish into the wilderness. From there he would travel west towards the northern mountains. Then he would traverse the length of them, keeping them to the west and the forest to the east. It was an exposed position, but it was safer than going through the woods, where the wildlings that had managed to scale the wall often lurked in wait, or through the mountains themselves where the mountain clans dwelled. He didn't fancy his odds against multiple wildlings and, despite the vastly different lives they lived to the northern lords, did not want to encounter the mountain clans who were loyal to House Stark. He would try and find somewhere sheltered to raise the dragon. Then, once she was big enough to look after herself, to fly and to hunt, which may only be a few weeks from now, he would decide what to do next. It all depended on how fast she grew. Above him 2 ravens caught as they swooped overhead, leaving Castle Black and heading south. His eyes moved up to glance at them and watch their progress as they flew past him and, eventually, went out of sight. To the Lord Commander it was a raven to Winterfell and a raven to King's Landing, one to Lady Stark and one for his father when he arrived. They were, in fact, one to his father and one to House Velaryon. Jon settled into his saddle as the horse continued its gentle trot and thought back to the conversation he had with Uncle Aemon. "House Velaryon," Jon said, as he ran his hands over Ghost's back, trying to pluck out some stray furs that the direwolf had started to leave everywhere he went. "You will need House Velaryon in the wars to come, nephew. There is not a Targaryen who ever successfully held that throne without a Velaryon by their side or without a Velaryon bound to them by blood or marriage. Your grandfather had Lucerys, the younger brother to Marcus, whose son is the current lord of the Driftmark. Aegon the Conqueror's mother was a Velaryon. Corlys Velaryon was instrumental in supporting Rhaenyra as heir. They are the blood of old Valyria, as we are," his uncle said patiently, his eyes on the dragon in his arms that was snoring gently, tiny puffs of smoke coming out of her nostrils. His eyes had not left her for nearly an hour, so captivated was he. "And Westeros will expect you to have House Velaryon on side. Even with this beautiful creature you will have a hard time winning around the lords of Westeros without House Velaryon. If you cannot convince them to support your claim, then you will not convince anyone else. What will you say? That the pact of ice and fire has been honored. They will know to what it refers, Aemon said, taking his eyes off the dragon for a moment to gaze at Jon. Rhaenyra's pact with House Stark, Jon said quietly. But I am a bastard. It will not matter to House Velaryon. They will desire vengeance for what happened in the rebellion. It will matter to others, yes. But not to them. And you are sure we can trust them, uncle? I do not doubt you, just you have been here for a long time and things have changed in Westeros, Jon said, feeling a flush creeping up his neck. Aemon laughed, an odd creaky sound. You do doubt me, nephew. Else you would not have said it. But do not doubt me on this. If there is one thing I know, it is the houses and friends House Targaryen has. You still have much to learn. They had spent hours crafting the letter to Montfort Velaryon. Then they had rewritten it. And rewritten it again. It could be intercepted, nephew. We cannot write it as we would say it. We must be cautious, Aemon said as he held up the final letter for inspection. Jon ran his eyes over it. To Lord Montfort Velaryon. Help comes to us from the most unusual of places, and though our loved ones are no longer with us, we must do our duty to our ancestors to find peace. Place your faith in your histories. Accept that mistakes have been made by all sides, and my apologies for the errors I made in my actions until now. Continue to rebuild your fleet and take heed of the advice your father will have given you before he died, and do not, for one instance, forget the past. In my final days on this earth, I want to atone for the mistakes I have made. Custom dictates that I do this in person, but I cannot leave this place. Forgive an old man for his rambling, for there is much I wish to say, and ever the shrewd man, I know you will understand. In truth, mistakes are not mine to apologize for, but I apologize anyway. Remember our house words and our signals and our friendship in the years to come. Galdane wrote that Westeros would never see the like of Corlys Velaryon again. This is not true. However long it takes to come, I know that House Velaryon will remain the old, the brave and the true. Others may forget, but I did not. Never forget who your true allies are, and understand that one day, our paths will cross again in this life or the next. Old and stiff knees do not bend easy. Unwavering in your loyalty should have been the motto of House Velaryon. Remember, a dragon does not forget. Essos is not where you should look, but go there regardless. And hold true to your vows of old, my friend, for those that do not will be honored with fire and blood. Maester Aemon of Castle Black. It sounds like the ramblings of an old man, Jon said, baffled. Yes. It does, his uncle said, a smile playing about his lips. You think he will understand? Yes. House Velaryon are smart. They will understand. Jon nodded, I hope so. Even now, Jon was torn between worrying that the message would not be received, or it would be received, either by the Velaryons or someone else, and the secret would be out. But there was nothing to be done. He had made his decision, and he would need allies. He just hoped that Aemon was right, that they would support his claim. He sighed and shifted slightly in his saddle. That was a problem for another day, and it would do him no good to dwell on it, as Uncle Aemon would have said. But it still niggled in the back of his mind. Next to him, Ghost huffed out a snort, drawing his attention back to the present. He smiled down at his friend and said quietly, she's asleep now. Do not wake her. Ghost nudged the saddlebag and huffed again. He smiled more strongly. He had worried that his little dragon would not take to his direwolf, or that Ghost would not take to her. Never in his life had he been so glad to be wrong. Two halves of a whole, Maester Aemon said, smiling sadly at him. His brothers and sisters are gone now, they are with your brothers and sisters. He is alone. A direwolf was not made to be alone. They are a pack animal. It is not surprising he would take to her. You are pack, and so, given your connection to her, so is she. But, a dragon. A dragon was made for solitude, although maybe, she will be different. She is alone. She is the last of her kind unless you do as I suggested. She has you and she has Ghost. She is smart. She will know that she will need him for many more moons. She has little choice but to tolerate him. Eventually, he will grow on her. Such is the way of the world. When she wakes up, I'll let her out, Jon said, turning back to the road. Ghost let out a louder huff and trotted faster, his legs stretching out. Then he suddenly broke into a proper run, the muscles in his legs rippling as he stretched out and gained more and more speed until he was almost out of sight. A loud howl pierced the air. John grinned and kicked his horse into a faster trot. Ghost was not meant to be caged up in Castle Black. He was meant to be free, like John. Seeing Ghost run free and howling in joy made it so clear to John the mistake he had been about to make. Even if John had ended up a ranger, he would not have been able to give Ghost what his friend deserved. Never in his life had he hated Eddard Stark as much as he did when Castle Black came into view all those weeks ago. His father must have known what it was truly like, and he still let him go there anyway. How could his father have let that happen? Uncle Benjen had tried to talk John out of wanting to join the war, but his father had been so supportive that John had thought he was making the right choice. Surely there had been other options open to him. Why had his father done it? He would find out one day. John kicked his horse into a leisurely canter. Ghost was now out of sight, but John did not mind. Ghost could take care of himself. He lost himself in the motion of riding and the feel of the air whipping past his face. About an hour later, when Castle Black was long behind him and out of sight and only the wall remained, he slowed his horse into a gentle trot and then a leisurely stroll before, finally, diverting off the King's Road. The dragon remained asleep in his saddlebag. He had been worried at first by how much she had slept, particularly given how the last Targaryen dragons had ended up. But Uncle Eamon had quickly stopped his worries. How much did Ghost sleep as a young pup? Hours every day. He would wake and play with his siblings, eat, and then sleep again. Eamon smiled. It is the same with human babes. And a dragon is much the same, I imagine. All they do is sleep, relieve themselves and eat. Let her sleep and enjoy her dreams. One day she will not have the luxury of uninterrupted and peaceful sleep, for you will be at war and she will have to stay awake for days on end to guard you. Let her be a child whilst you can. The horse walked slowly through the hills and fields of the Gift. He navigated widely around Molestown and instead went southwest from Castle Black, towards Queenscrown. The sun was not yet past the highest point in the sky when he encountered the clump of trees and woods that marked the whole waypoint between Castle Black and Queenscrown. He waited for a moment at the entrance to the trees until he heard heavy panting. Then he pressed on. He knew Ghost would always find him, and he would always find Ghost, but there was something comforting about having his direwolf by his side as he entered the woods. He leaned down and let go of his reins briefly, knowing his horse would keep going regardless, and rummaged around in one of his saddlebags for some dried meat and fruit leather. It was not a filling meal, but it was the best he could do in the saddle. He only wanted to stop when completely necessarily he had to put as much distance between himself and Castle Black and the route he should have taken as he could. He straightened and ripped off a bit of dried meat with his teeth, chewing as he thought about when the best time to stop would be. Concluding that he would stop once his dragon woke up, he settled back into his saddle, and continued chewing on his dried meat. Once he was finished, a tiny shriek alerted him to the fact his dragon was already awake. Her snout poked out of the saddlebag, and he carefully leaned down to pick her up and place her on the saddle in front of him. From there she let out a languid stretch, like a cat, and then scuttled up his body, nearly slipping as she placed a foot on the dagger strapped to his thigh, and wound herself around his neck. She stuck her tongue out into his ear and hissed slightly. "Hungry?" he said, eyes fixed ahead. She let out another little shriek. He sighed and shoved his reins into one hand, then fished about in his pocket for some cooked meat that Uncle Eamon had given him for today's journey. He wrinkled his nose as it found it. His cloak was going to stink. As soon as his hand withdrew from his pocket, she let out a happy noise, almost a chirp, and scuttled back down his body to eat from his hand. Then she curled up in a ball, head resting on his horse's neck, and settled down. He was not fooled though, she was awake. This was her first time in the outside world, and he knew she wanted to take everything in. He decided not to stop and instead continue on so she could get used to the world before she was put on the ground for the first time. Several hours later, he was deep in the woods, heading south towards Queenscrown, when he decided he needed to stop and stretch his legs. He carefully dismounted and then unclipped the front part of the reins, looped them over the horse's head, taking care not to dislodge the bridle, and tethered his mount to a tree. Then he pulled Dark Sister out of one of the larger saddlebags and carefully tied the straps around his waist. He was far away enough from Castle Black now that he felt he could wear it with pride. Ghost trotted up next to him and shoved his nose into his side. John smiled and then he picked up the dragon from the saddle, deposited her in front of Ghost. "Stay here. I need to stretch my legs," he said. Ghost huffed and settled down. The dragon gave him a slightly inquisitive look but settled down between Ghost's front paws, her head up as she stared around the clearing, taking everything in. Her eyes fixed on the trees, and he watched her for a moment. Then, he smiled and began to walk away from his companions. His path took him in several loops around the clearing as he stretched his arms and flexed his fingers. It had been a long time since he had ridden for so long without a break. The trip to the wall with Tyrion Lannister and Uncle Benjen had been littered with rest stops for the dwarf. But today he had left Castle Black at sunrise, and it was now well past the midday point. Over 6 hours he had spent in the saddle so far. He was halfway through his 6th loop of the large clearing when he heard the snap of a branch. He paused, hand immediately going to Dark Sister. His eyes scanned the tree line but saw nothing. He turned slightly to look at where his horse, the dragon and Ghost were. Ghost was watching him with large red eyes, but his hackles were not raised. He seemed calm. Neither the horse nor dragon looked bothered. Instincts telling him that he had to be sure there was nothing there. No one could see his dragon. He spun on the spot and headed off towards where he thought the sound came from. He kept his hand on the pommel of Dark Sister as he crossed out of sight from the clearing. He walked slow and straight for several minutes, pushing branches out of the way as he went. Twigs snapped underfoot and he silently cursed, stealthy he was not. Then he paused when he heard a branch snap behind him and tuned to face the direction it came from. He instantly made to withdraw Dark Sister, but he was a second too late. He ducked rather than continue trying to withdraw the sword as an axe swung at him from out of the trees. It flew clean over the top of him as he stumbled backwards several paces, crouching low. When he straightened up, he hastily withdrew his sword to face his attackers. There were 3 of them. Wrapped in furs with long bears and thick, unkempt hair. One had 2 axes, one had one. Presumably the axe that had just been thrown at John came from that man, and the last man had a short sword. John squinted at the blade. It was fine work. But the men were not northerners, he could tell from the way they held themselves. They were too feral, for lack of a better word, to be northerners. Wildings. "I have no quarrel with you. Leave me in peace and I will spare your life," he said, even as he took another step back. He knew he could not let them live, they were too close to where he had left Ghost and the dragon. But he still wanted to give them that chance, foolish though it was. "Pretty words, boy. They match your pretty sword." The one closest to John, with thick graying brown hair and patch, scraggly beard, said. The man took a step forward as he spoke, and John took one back. The man closest to the first man laughed mockingly. Always knew northerners were cowards. The third man spoke next. "I tire of this. Let's end him and continue south." "You do not give me orders," the first one said, shifting slightly to face the first man. The second one also turned to give the third man his attention. John struck. He had crossed the few feet of space separating them before they realized he had moved. Dark Sister swung quickly, far more quickly than he had anticipated given how light it was, and found its way slicing through the neck of the second man, who had not even realized what had happened before his head fell free from his body. Dark Sister continued its path, however, and swung free of John's hand, the force of his strike sending it spinning across the clearing, away from him. He swore under his breath and made to dart past the 2 remaining men. He was too slow. 2 arms wrapped around him and pulled him back. Instead of fighting, he pushed himself back, using the force of his feet on the ground to give him leverage. Together he and the man who had reached for him fell onto the floor, the man behind him cushioning his fall. As the man let out a pained noise, and there was a sickening crunch like broken bones, John broke free and scrabbled for the dagger on his leg. He clambered to his feet, breathing heavily, still grasping for his dagger. He pulled the dagger free just in time to thrust it away from his face, so it met the man's axe. The blunt edge of the back of his dagger met the iron of the axe, pausing its descent. The dagger sung beautifully as the 2 weapons collided, at complete contrast to the dull thud the axe made. The crack of the weapons meeting sent such a force down John's arm that he nearly dropped the dagger in pain. Instead, He tightened his grip on the handle and pushed forward against the axe, using his feet to give him leverage on the solid ground, forcing his weight forwards, desperate to get the axe further away from his body. He was my brother. The man who held the axe, the third man spat out angrily. He was a fool. John panted, I told you to leave. The man spat at him, but John ignored the dribble of saliva that hit his cheek and then ran down it even when it started to drip off his chin. Instead he kept pushing. The man was bigger than him, much bigger. But John had found a good grip on the ground and was using his body weight to keep the man at bay. The man gave John one final push and then withdrew his axe, to bring it back down. John dived out of the way and the man fell forward, unable to stop his fall given the force at which he had lunged, impaling his axe on the second man. John stared in horror. Then he choked out a laugh, doubling over as he watched the scene in front of him. Hysteria took over. The third man wrenched himself off the second body with ease and grasped around in the undergrowth until he emerged with the axe that had been thrown at John earlier. He spun to face John and charged. John was still bent double, laughing, unable to stop as the man charged. A howl sounded in the distance. It was like something snapped into place. He straightened, dagger in his hand, and let the man run at him. The man held the axe high as he charged. John was smaller, he held the dagger out and waited as the man went at him fully tilt. He anchored his legs carefully, spreading them so his weight was evening placed. The force of the man's body hitting him sent him back several paces, but he did not fall, and he held his dagger firm in front of him as the man ran straight into it. The man screamed as John's dagger impaled him in the gut. He dropped the axe he had been holding and it fell to the earth with a soft thump, skimming just past John's left ear. He gazed down at John with surprise and horror on his face. His eyes widened and John felt a moment of pity. Then the man snarled and tried to pull himself free from the blade. John leaned forward and twisted the dagger in deeper and the man screamed out in pain again. John flinched. Then he kept going, driving his dagger deeper into the man's belly. Then, finally, he ripped his dagger upwards as far as he could, and back towards him, using the strength from his spread legs to give him more force. Then John stepped back as he pulled the dagger free. The man's screams stopped, and he fell to his knees, blood pouring from his belly and his bowels ripped and in tatters as they swung uselessly from the gaping hole John had left. "Burn me," the man gasped out. Then, he fell face first into the dirt. John stumbled backwards, eyes glued to the body. Then he retched everywhere. Again and again, he threw up the remains of his midday meal until there was no food inside and instead, he was just coughing up liquid. He grimaced as a string of it hung by his mouth and wiped it away. Then, remembering the man had spat on his earlier, he hastily rubbed his hand over his face. He turned to face the bodies of the two men he had killed and the third man who had been killed by his friend. Then he laughed again. 3 on 1 and he had won. And he had lost his sword. He laughed harder. A shiver racked his spine, and he wiped his hand down his face even as he continued hacking out laugh after laugh. He couldn't stop. It wasn't funny, not at all. But he couldn't stop. A loud howl sounded nearby, and he spun around, dagger still in hand. His laughter stopped as his body readied for another fight, but then Ghost emerged from the other side of the clearing, red eyes bright and hackles raised, and John relaxed. His eyes scanned Ghost for any sign of injury, but there was none. Other than dirt and mud, his friend was completely as John had left him. He sighed and relaxed further. Then he stiffened, the dragon. He had left the dragon with Ghost. Where was the dragon? He spun on the spot, eyes sweeping over the clearing. Then he lifted his eyes to the sky even though he knew she would likely not be airborne for at least another moon. Nothing. A small snort drew his attention back to Ghost. His direwolf padded forwards and bent his head. There, nestled behind his direwolf's head and at the top of his spin and curled up in a tiny ball of grey was his dragon. She blended perfectly into the slight dirt on Ghost's coat, her grey concealing her perfectly. He smiled. By all appearances his dragon had not moved since he had left them, other than to move from the floor to his direwolf's back. "Good boy," he murmured quietly as he rubbed his fingers behind his friend's ears. "Thank you for looking after her." He sighed and sank to his knees and murmured, "I have never killed a man today, and now I have killed 2. I laughed and I could not stop. And then I was sick. What does that make me? A man who laughs at death and is sick after he kills someone. I have watched father behead men who have fled the watch before and been fine. But this was different. Uncle Eamon said it would be different. Rob would laugh and call me a coward if he saw me now. Ghost heaved out a few heavy pants but did not respond. Instead, he made a move that looked suspiciously like a shrug to try and dislodge the dragon. The dragon squawked and stood upright on Ghost's back, wings out. There was a brief pause as the dragon's eyes swung around the clearing. Then her eyes fixed on the body closest to John and, even as John watched, she hooked off Ghost and scuttled over to the body. She nudged the man's head a few times with her snout and then, stepped back. Then she coughed. Once. Twice. 3 times and finally the smallest sliver of white flames came out her mouth. The man's hair caught fire and then went out. John smiled, despite the grisly scene. "You are growing, little one," he murmured. He rose then walked forward to pick her up and she squawked at him before settling on his shoulders, tail swung around the back of his neck and onto his other arm to steady herself. He reached down carefully to wipe his dagger in the long grass, trying to get off any blood. Then he straightened. "We cannot burn the bodies, it will be dark soon and the fire will draw attention to us," he said, even as the dragon hissed and tried to cough out more flames. He sighed and turned away from the grisly sight. "I do not have the energy to bury them. Come." Then he strode off in the direction his sword had gone. He found it within a few minutes of rummaging about in the bushes and glared at it. He would need to practice, he could not have it flying off because he overswung. He cursed the fact that he had not been able to practice with it at Castle Black. The mistake today could have cost him his life. He had to do better. He sheathed Dark Sister and headed back towards where he had left his horse, Ghost, and the dragon. The clearing was just as he left it, horse tied to the tree and his bags still slung on its back. Good. Although he doubted Ghost would have let anyone near the horse. He stopped and made sure no one was around before he dropped the dragon on the ground. She chittered loudly and scurried off in a funny arch towards the horse rather than taking the direct route. He watched as she clambered up the tree the horse was tethered to, like some sort of lizard from the south that Maestlawin had told him about, and then hurled herself off a branch just above the saddle and used her wings to glide down onto the horse's back. Then she curled up in a ball, just in front of the saddle, and did not move. He smiled. It would not be long before she was too big to do that. She was growing noticeably. The fact she had spat out fire earlier made him think that, soon, she might be ready to fly. Good. He needed her to be able to defend herself. "I will not make the same mistake again, do not worry," he said quietly as Ghost jabbed him in the side with his nose. Ghost huffed out a snort. John smiled at his faithful companion and gave him another quick scratch before he headed over to his horse. He flinched as he mounted his horse and realized his earlier fall was going to leave a nasty bruise. Once mounted, he gave the clearing another quick glance and then kicked his horse forward, wanting to be gone from this place before he lost too much daylight. Hours later, Queen's Crown came into view. He had not planned to stop here, in fact he had hoped to be further into his journey than this, but given darkness was beginning to set in he had no choice but to bed down for the night soon. He headed towards the town on the edge of the lake and dismounted. The town was as dilapidated as Uncle Benjen had warned him it was. It was perfect. He carefully walked to what appeared to be an old barn and pushed the door open. It creaked as it swung inwards, and he flinched at the loud noise. Nothing happened, however. He paused and, sensing his apprehension, Ghost trotted in first. John smiled and headed in after him. The barn smelled like sweat and blood, but there was no one there. John relaxed slightly. Uncle Benjen had warned him that although the town was long abandoned it was often used by wildlings and that John should take care. They had debated the merits of John trying to sleep in Queen's Crown itself, instead of the remnants of the village surrounding it, but agreed that it was safer for John to have multiple escape routes, if needed. John headed to the furthest corner of the barn, into one of the stalls, and carefully tied his horse up. Then he loosened the girth on his saddle 2 notches. He would not take it off completely on the off chance he needed to make a quick escape, but the 2 notches would ease any discomfort the horse felt. The dragon that was still resting in front of the saddle huffed in indignation as he picked it up and settled it on the ground. He picked out his dinner for the night from a saddlebag, dried meat and an apple, and moved back from his horse. It shook itself and then ducked its head to chew on some old hay. He grimaced, wondering how long the hay had been there, but chose to leave the horse to its meal. It had been a long ride today and the horse was likely starving and tired. Tomorrow he would not push it as hard. He turned and followed the dragon to the far corner of the store, next to the entrance, and settled down. The dragon hopped onto his lap and Ghost padded over and curled up next to them. "You will need to hunt tomorrow, Ghost," he said conversationally to his direwolf, who just blinked at him in response. "She needs more meat, and you are the better hunter of the two of us." The direwolf blinked at him, his large red eyes vanishing for a moment behind his eyelids. Then he shoved his nose under his tail and went to sleep. "I guess this means I am taking the first watch," John murmured, gently rubbing his fingers between the spines on his dragon's back. He leaned back, resting his head against the wall of the stall as the dragon purred at his attention. "I cannot keep calling you the dragon or she in my head. I need to name you. What do you think I should name you?" "I thought about naming you after a dragon of old, but so many of them had such miserable lives and there is so much tragedy linked to them, it does not feel fair. I could name you after a Targaryen queen of old, but again so much of them suffered so much. I could name you directly for my mother, but it would not do you or her justice, for you are not her." The dragons shifted slightly under his administrations. He cast his eyes down as she rose onto her legs and placed the tips of her wings on his chest to peer at him, his face inches from her. It was a strangely hound-like action from her. He smiled at the picture she presented. "Winter," he said quietly, gazing into her white eyes. "A dragon from my father's family, named for my mother's. House Targaryen's words might be fire and blood, but I am as much a Stark as anything else. One day, winter will come with fire and blood for those who forsook their vows and destroyed my family." The dragon let out what could only be described as a soft purr, her tongue darted out and she huffed out some smoke. Then she settled back down on his lap and closed her eyes. John sighed and resumed stroking the space between her spines. His mind turned to the second raven winging its way south. He hoped it made it there and his father understood his choice. ****. When John opened his eyes the next morning, he had to blink a few times before he realized it was daytime and not still night. There was hardly any light coming through the smashed windows and half-rotted door and, at first, the darkness seemed so oppressive his first thought was it was still night. The dawn chorus of the birds quickly ended that theory and he realized with a sense of foreboding that the reason it was so dark in the barn was because there was hardly any light outside. Rain clouds had gathered. He stretched languidly and then cast his gaze around. Ghost was curled up next to him, staring at him with beautiful red eyes, but Winter was gone. He bolted upright, eyes moving quickly around the store. She wasn't there. A small shriek from a distance away grabbed his attention. He rose quickly, nearly stumbling in his haste, and darted out the stable towards the barn door. He shoved it open as far as needed for him to be able to squeeze through and froze on the threshold. Winter was crouched facing away from him, head down, chewing on the remains of a rabbit carcass. Smoke arched upwards from the body, the stench of burning flesh and fur in the air. John grimaced as he took in the grisly sight. Then he paused and turned to look at Ghost, who had huffed up behind him, unable to get through the door. "Did you hunt it for her?" Ghost gave him a baleful look and turned, walking back towards the stable. Another shriek pulled John's attention back to his dragon. She had turned to look at him, chewing languidly on a piece of meat. Once she realized she had caught his attention, she hopped to one side and made a funny gesture at the carcass with her head. He shook his head, wondering if she was offering him her kill. She shrieked again and spat a slither of fire in his direction. He sighed and settled down on the floor next to the carcass, watching her eat. She turned her attention back to her food and ate her way through the entire carcass as John watched. Eventually, she gave the bones a nudge with her snout, clearly to ensure that she had not missed anything, and scampered over to him. Then she curled up in his lap, let out a gentle belch and went to sleep. He sighed. He did not want to shift her off him and begin the journey further south. He liked the solitude here and the time spent with Winter and Ghost. He stared over the lake, wondering whether he would need to move up his decision to act if she could already breathe fire, and absently rubbed his dragon's spine as she purred at the attention. It would not be long now before she could fly, and when that day came, he would have little choice but to start on his plan. Interlude 298 AC Aemon Targaryen, flashback. I have met men from the north and from the south. I have met men from Essos and Westeros. I have met men who were so devout that they would not leave their place of worship for anything or anyone, and I have met men who cared nothing for the gods. I have met good men and bad men. Men who thought they were always right, and men who battled their own demons to just rise from their bed each day. Men I would have been proud to call blood, and men who were blood that I was ashamed to know. Men I would have killed and men I would have killed for. All men are different. Yet all men have one thing in common. Do you know what all that one thing is, nephew? Jon shook his head, eyes fixed on the dragon. They have something to fight for. Something that gives them purpose. They have something that makes life worth living. Whether that be the belief that they themselves were the gods or their love for their family. Even a drunk has ale and wine. Everyone has a weakness, nephew, and everyone has something they live for. For now, she is your weakness, and you will likely do unspeakable things to protect her, and one day, hopefully a long time from now, you will be hers. Eventually she will be big enough that nothing can stop her, and you will be the easiest target to hurt her. One day, you will grow old and frail, and she will burn whole cities to the ground to protect you if she has to, Aemon said, ending on a firm tone. Everyone has a weakness, Jon murmured, eyes fixed on the dragon. Aemon nodded, but Jon paid his actions no attention. He did not mind, he knew his nephew was listening to this listen regardless of where his gaze was. It was his last lesson and the most important. They were sequestered in his room, a fire roaring in the hearth and the dragon on Jon's lap. Ghost was settled on the bed as though he were some sort of common hound, soft snores coming out of his mouth as Jon sat on the edge of Aemon's bed, next to Ghost. Aemon was at his desk. Books littered the ground around him, and 2 empty bowls of stew sat on the floor near his feet. I will never forgive myself if something happens to her, Jon said eventually, breaking the peaceful silence that settled over them. You will not need to. You will kill anyone who might pose a risk to her, Aemon said in a matter-of-fact tone of voice. Jon's eyes flicked up from the dragon to Aemon, large and afraid. I have never killed a man before, he said, after a length pause. Nor have I, and I likely never will. But for her, he said, gesturing at the dragon in his nephew's lap, I would kill every man who would harm her. Then he sighed and said more gently, Jon, you have no choice. Now that she is here, you will have no choice but to kill any man who threatens her and, until she is big enough to protect herself, any man who sees her. She is too small to defend herself for now. She will not be this small forever, one day she will be big enough to cast shadows across whole towns and you will have no choice. War is coming and you need to be ready. I do not say this needlessly or to scare you. But I need you to understand what is coming. I know, Jon said in a hushed tone, his eyes fixed on the dragon. Then his eyes turned back to Aemon. Some of the men who come to the Watch cannot have taken a life before they join the Rangers. How do they react once they have? Aemon gazed thoughtfully at Jon before he said, different men have different reactions. You would do better to talk to your uncle Benjen about this, as he is the one who takes out the new Rangers. Jon pulled a face before Aemon finished speaking. Aemon sighed, you do not wish to talk to your uncle because you think he will not understand why you are asking. Jon nodded. Very well. I have seen men who have refused to go back out as a ranger and have instead moved to the stewards. Once, a man took his own life. He jumped from the top of the wall. Benjen once told me of a man who could not stop crying afterwards. The man he had killed had chopped off his hand and he had, in return, plunged his sword through the man's throat, and yet he still cried after he had taken a life. People respond in different ways. There is no right way to respond to taking a life, Jon. There is a wrong way, enjoying it. But never a right way, Aemon said, eyes on the dragon. Do you know anyone who has ever enjoyed it? My brother, Aerion did, I think. He never seemed troubled after he took a life, and with each life he took, he seemed to enjoy it more and more. Daeron once described him as a monster, and I do not think a true word was ever said about Aerion, Aemon replied, eyes now on Jon. My grandfather must have. Yes. Like Aerion. Both were sick. You saw what my nephew Jaehaerys said in the letter he sent me. When a Targaryen is born, the gods toss a coin in the air. Yes, Aemon said gently. I know what ails you, Jon. You fear needlessly. You will not be like them. You will be the best of us. You will be as strong as my father, as wise as Jaehaerys, you will be as loved as Viserys, and you will be a fighter like Aegon the Conqueror. As Aemon watched, Jon blushed. Jon's eyes fixed back on his dragon and he struggled for words for a moment. Aemon watched as he swallowed twice in quick succession. I will do you proud, uncle. Aemon smiled but said nothing. The fire crackled merrily as silence settled over them. I do not want to leave, Jon said so quietly that Aemon had to strain to hear his nephew's voice. Jon lifted his eyes from his dragon and Aemon was surprised to see tears in them. Aemon gave him a sad smile. I do not want you to go either. The Starks were my family, but I always felt like an outsider. I slept in a separate wing of the castle. I had to do worse in my lessons. Even Robb called me a bastard once, Jon murmured, his eyes on Aemon's but his fingers continuing to trace down the dragon's spine between her spikes. This last moons with you and Uncle Benjen I have felt like I had a proper family. You have taught me more in these moons than I ever learned in all my years at Winterfell. Aemon blinked, trying to get rid of the tears that threatened to spill, and said even more quietly than Jon, we will always be your family, Jon. Nothing can ever change that. I am sorry for what you went through before we found each other. Jon nodded, I know. Then he smiled, brightly at Aemon, and said more strongly, I would not change my history for anything. I have no regrets. My past is what brought me here. Without my childhood at Winterfell, I may not have traveled to the wall. I would not have met you. I would not have met her. You are learning, nephew. Jon smiled and then said, Uncle, do you have any regrets? Anything you would do differently if you could? Aemon regarded him carefully, then he turned his attention to the flickering frames. I did, once. But not anymore. My vows were tested 3 times, once as a son, once as a maester and once as a man of the Night's Watch. Each time I honored my vows and each time I regretted it after. But I did not deviate from the path I set myself down all those years ago. Seeing you for the first time was my 4th test and, now I know that despite all the hurt it brought me adhering to my vows all those years, that I made the right decision. So, no, I do not have any regrets. What were the tests? Aemon kept his eyes on the flames. The first test was when I was a boy. My mother was sick. She caught the Great Spring Sickness in 209 AC. She begged me to leave her, to not visit her again. She asked me to take care of my brother, Egg. She made me promise to not leave his side. To look after him. He was a sickly child, he needed me. So, I promised her that I would stay with him. I made a vow. The last time I saw her, she was telling me to go, and I left. I did not tell her that I loved her, and I did not say goodbye. I stormed from the room like the petulant child I was. She grew sicker and sicker, and I stuck by my vow to not go and visit her, no matter how hard it got. I was scarcely a boy of 1 and 10 and yet I stuck by my vows. I longed to break them. Every night I lay there wishing I had the courage to break them, to see her. But I did not. I honored the vow I made to her, for I knew, even then, that she would not have extracted my vow if she did not think it necessary. You cannot begin to imagine the torment, knowing that my mother was dying and knowing that she did not wish me to see her, and my last words to her were those of spite. I never saw her again and I have never forgiven myself. The second test was when I was a man. We have already discussed it. My father summoned me to King's Landing, asking me to serve on the small council. He wanted my advice, and I said no and went to my older brother on Dragonstone. It tested my vows more than anything had until that point. My position on the small council would have undermined the Grand Maester, but I so wanted to be there to give my father advice. I have already said we had never been close, but that he sought me out, it meant more than words could express. Saying no to him, adhering to my vows to put aside house and family loyalties was difficult, but most of all it tested my vows as a maester. I had chosen to serve the cause, not serve House Targaryen. I suppose I still chose my family in the end, for I went to my brother, but I chose my vow to the maesters over my family when they needed me. I did not choose my father and I spent many years wishing I had. And, like my mother, I never spoke to him again. The third test was the worst. It was when I got news of the end of the rebellion, which was long over by then. I read the scroll 2 days before I gave it to the then Lord Commander. 2 days I sat, and I stewed. I was old by then, John. I was 85 when I read that scroll. I had already lived nearly twice as long as most of the men born when I was. I read in a scroll that my family were dead. Eris, dead. Rolla, dead on the birthing bed. Roriga, dead. Elia, dead. Rhaenys, dead. Aegon, dead. Only Viserys and Daenerys alive and on the run. And, eventually, after 2 days I decided that I would be of no help. I was an old man, I would be more a hindrance than a help. So, I gave the Lord Commander the scroll and the news it contained, including that men loyal to House Targaryen were on their way to the wall, and I resigned myself to praying to the gods every night that Viserys and Daenerys lived. Of all my tests, that was the one I nearly broke my vows for. I did not, and, until a few moons ago, I spent every waking minute regretting it, even though I knew that I would not have been an asset to them. A hand reached out to touch his leg and Aemon blinked and turned his attention from the flames to his leg. He realized that Jon had left the bed and was kneeling in front of him, tears in his eyes. Aemon smiled weakly at his nephew. "Why did you break your vows for me?" Aemon turned back to the flames and said quietly, "Many reasons." He laughed, slightly brokenly, and continued, "Hubris, this was my chance to make amends for all the mistakes I made in the years prior, and you are young, and I have years of experience to help you, to guide you, ensure you learned from my mistakes and those of our family so you can take back our throne. Vengeance, for all that we have lost. I cannot deny that I had hoped that you would be my opportunity for House Targaryen to be reborn and right the wrongs that were done to us. You are young, you can do what I could not. Redemption, over 80 years of mistakes and regrets is a heavy toll on one's mind. If you live even half as long as I have, you will have your fair share of regrets, nephew. My regrets torture me every night. I close my eyes at night, and I see my brothers and my sisters. I see my mother and my father. I think about what I could have done to change it all, and I wake up crying every morning because I am still here having wasted my life and they are gone. And finally, and most importantly of all, love. You were the first of my blood I have seen in many years, and I felt a kinship the moment I saw you, and I did not wish for you to die here, as I will. I wanted you to have the chance of life that I squandered. When I saw you, I saw a boy who was about to make the biggest mistake of his life, and I could not let it happen. I guess for all the reasons I have listed, love most of all. But you are my redemption, Jon. You have given me a purpose, and I will meet the gods knowing that I did not fail our house, not in the end. You are my vengeance, for you shall rebuild our house no matter what you choose. You are my hubris, for you shall not make the mistakes I did because you will know better. And you are my family, I knew who you were the moment I saw you, and I loved you from that point." By the time he had finished talking, tears were pouring thick and fast down his face. He hastily withdrew his hands from Jon and wiped his tears away. Once he was done, he turned to look at Jon, who was still kneeling on the floor with a peculiar expression on his face. For a moment, Aemon wondered what was wrong. Then he worried he had upset his nephew by his phrasing of why he had made the decision. Then he realized. "No one has ever told you that they love you before, have they?" Jon shook his head slowly. "I know my brothers and sisters do, and I know that father does. I know that Uncle Benjen does, and now I know that you do. But no one had ever said it before." Aemon smiled and picked up Jon's hand that was resting on his knee where it had fallen lax when Aemon had withdrawn his own to wipe his tears. "I love you, Jon. And whether you choose to conquer Westeros on Dragonback or flee to Essos to be with your family, I will still love you. All I want from you is a promise me that when you leave here, you do not look back. Not ever. I promise, Uncle." Chapter 5, Fealty. Chapter Text. Chapter Summary. Montford Valerian decrypts the letter from Aemon Targaryen. Ned Stark receives a raven from Jon. Jon decides where to go. In our interlude, we learn about Lyanna Stark. 298 AC Montford Valerian. It was not yet dawn when Maester Gerard burst into his chambers, unannounced. Montford jerked upright in his bed even as he reached for the dagger under his pillow. Thankfully, he had not been asleep, otherwise he likely would have responded more erratically. He heaved out a sigh and relaxed when he realized that it was only his maester and not a horde of pirates. This had better be important, Gerard, he grumbled as he sat up in his bed and watched as Gerard huffed out deep breath after deep breath. Gerard did not respond, and so Montfort busied himself with dressing for the day ahead. It was chilly on the Driftmark in the mornings, the sea breeze, even on a calm day, was cold, and so one was always wise to wear a cloak even when the weather appeared fair. By the time he had finished wrapping his green cloak around him and clasped it closed with a gold seahorse, his maester had not straightened up and was still hunched over, breathing heavily. Montfort huffed quietly and wandered over to his fireplace, giving the driftwood within a prod with the poker to ensure that there was adequate burning material. He then grabbed a mug of water from the jug and settled down next to the fireplace. He propped one leg over the other at a right angle and settled back in his chair whilst he waited for Gerard to respond. His maester was looking older as the days passed by. Not for the first time he hoped that his maester would outlive him. Montaris would need the guidance of the wise old man in his first few years of ruling, much like Montfort had before him and his father before him. But he knew, deep down, that Gerard would likely not be around in 10 years, never mind the 20 years Montfort hoped he still had left. Eventually, Gerard straightened up from where he had been bent over, hands on his knees. He heaved in a deep breath and said, "Raven. From House Targaryen." His leg dropped and he lurched forward, hand outstretched. "You are sure?" "Yes," Gerard said, still in a breathy voice as he crossed the space between them and handed the scroll over to Montfort. Montfort eyed his maester carefully. Gerard was of Valyrian heritage, fair-haired and purple-eyed, just as Montfort was. Just as many of the men of the Driftmark and Dragonstone were. He was older, though his once blonde hair was now completely white and the lines around his eyes were increasing year on year. He had been a loyal maester and friend to Montfort and to Montfort's father before him. "A good man, there is no one I trust more," was what his father had said to Montfort before he had died. Montfort agreed. If Gerard did die before him, he would be hard pushed to find the new maester the Citadel sent as trustworthy and easy to respect. Gerard did not flinch under his inspection and instead maintained a steady gaze. "By rights I should send this straight to Dragonstone or King's Landing," Montfort said quietly, eyes on his maester. "You should. How long have you served at Driftmark, my friend?" "Over 50 years. Montfort nodded. He had known it was something like that. He just had not expected it to be quite that long. "So, you remember the rule of Aegon and of Jaehaerys?" "Yes. Good men. King Aegon stopped here often." Montfort sighed. "We have been punished under Robert Baratheon. Our army is reduced. Our ships are reduced. Our tax levies are higher. He is a man who does nothing but drink and fuck his way through whores like he will not live another day," he said after a few moments. Gerard inclined his head in agreement and Montfort pressed on, "I would ask your counsel, my friend." Gerard twitched and Montfort gestured towards the seat opposite him. Gerard settled down carefully and turned his attention from his lord to gaze into the flames. "Do you wish me counsel as your friend, or as your maester?" "Both." Gerard nodded without turning his attention from the flames. "Reading the letter is not treachery in itself. You would be a fool to send it directly to Lord Stannis or to King's Landing without reading it." "You are not a fool," Gerard began, then he turned his head from the flames to give Montfort a wry smile. "The old, the true, the brave, are the words of House Velaryon for a reason. I counseled your father the same thing many years ago. House Targaryen helped House Velaryon reach heights that House Velaryon might never have reached on their own, and House Velaryon gained much from their friendship with House Targaryen. Read the letter. Then decide what to do. That is my advice as your friend and as your maester." He made to rise. "Sit. I would have more counsel from you." Gerard nodded and settled back down. Montfort turned his attention to the scroll and ran his finger over the unbroken wax seal of the three-headed dragon. He had not thought he would ever see it again. He smiled and broke the seal quickly. His eyes skimmed down the letter once, twice, 3 times. He leaned back in his chair thoughtfully and fixed his eyes on the fire. This changed everything. Rhaegar's child safely in the north and nearly a man grown if he had done the calculations right. He laughed. "Come. We need to go to my solar," he said as he rose. He crossed the room quickly and opened the door without pausing to see if Gerard was following. It was a long walk from his chambers to his solar. He paused twice, once to order servants to bring food for 3 to his solar and to clean his chambers, and once to ask a different servant to find his brother. Gerard hurried along behind him, taking 2 strides for every one of Montford's. "My lord. Is something wrong?" Gerard huffed out as Montford picked up the pace. "No, my friend. It is far from wrong," he replied, his voice sounding more joyful than it had in moons. Abruptly, Montford took a sharp turn and headed off towards his father's old solar. He had always refused to take it as his own. The death of his father was still difficult to digest all these years later.